Most people think the Atlantic during the Second World War was ruled by the submarine that could stay longest underwater, could dive deepest, could hide most completely in the dark. But the truth is far more nuanced and far more fragile than that. The submarines that shaped the war's outcome weren't built to disappear forever into the depths. They were machines that had to compromise constantly between the need to hide and the need to breathe. They were steel tubes filled with men who understood, in their bones, that surfacing meant death and staying down meant slowly suffocating. And between those two impossible choices, there emerged a thin metal pipe, a tube so simple in concept, so elegant in its necessity, that it would alter the course of an entire naval war. If you've ever wondered about the quiet mechanical innovations that saved lives, or cost them, in the hidden battles beneath the waves, if you want to understand how fear and mathematics and human desperation can combine to shape history through the smallest of engineering decisions, subscribe now for Fall Asleep 2, the complete history of the Schnorchel, the invention that kept U-boats alive. Our documentary series explores the machines, the men, and the moments that quietly defined the war beneath the surface. And this story of the Schnorchel is one of those moments that changes everything. Picture now, if you will, a night in the Atlantic that never truly begins or ends. It is the deep, moonless night of wartime, the kind of darkness that erases the horizon entirely. The water moves with a slow and ancient rhythm, not violent, but patient, indifferent. The soft Atlantic swell, rolling from west to east, in long, low undulations. No moon rises to illuminate anything. No stars shine through the cloud cover that has settled over these waters like a lid. The darkness is complete and unremarkable, the same darkness that has covered this ocean for centuries, and yet on this particular night, on so many nights during the years of 1943, 1944, 1945, there is something new breaking through that surface, something that was not there before. It is impossibly thin, barely thicker than a human forearm, a dark metallic tube, no more than a foot or so in diameter, rising from the invisible water below like a periscope's younger sibling, like a single breath being drawn from the air itself. In the moonless dark, it is invisible to aircraft flying overhead. To the naked eye of a lookout on a distant ship, it registers as nothing, as less than nothing, as a moment of water that happened to catch the wind in an unusual way. The tube sits there, motionless, drinking air, and nothing in the entire theatre of the Atlantic War appears to have changed. And yet everything has. Below the surface, at a depth of between 30 and 40 meters, a diesel engine turns. This should not be possible. This should violate every principle of submarine design that the world's navies had understood up until the moment this tube was first tested. A diesel engine requires fresh air to burn fuel. Fresh air cannot exist underwater. Fresh water that reaches a diesel engine at depth will compress the air being drawn in, will create pressures and temperatures that no conventional engineering should withstand. Fresh water leaking into an exhaust system routed backward through a submerged hull should cause flooding, and flooding means drowning, and drowning is what submariners have feared since the first submarine ever existed. But that tube, that Schnorchel, as the Germans called it, that thin and improbable pipe reaching from the ocean floor toward the night sky, that tube makes it possible, barely, fragilely, with constant risk and recurring mechanical failure and the kind of human endurance that borders on the unreasonable. That tube, and the engineering that supports it, allows a submarine to run its engines while fully submerged. It allows a U-boat to charge its batteries, to cruise beneath the surface, to move through waters where it cannot be seen, breathing through that single narrow straw. For the men inside the hull below, the sensation is something that has no adequate comparison to surface life. The air they're breathing has already been breathed by the men around them. The diesel fumes that would normally escape through the conning tower are now being routed back into the pressure hull, creating a subtle haze in the compartments, a constant low-level irritation to the eyes and lungs, a chemical taste that coats the tongue after hours of submersion. The condensation on every metal surface runs steady now, collecting in thin rivulets, dripping, pooling. The space is cramped, always has been. The space has always been a compressed version of life, a coffin with a diesel heartbeat. But now it feels compressed in a new way. Now there is a consciousness of the very narrow margin between operation and catastrophe. Now there is the understanding that this tube, this thin connection to the outside world, this single point of vulnerability at the surface, is the only reason the air they're breathing isn't already poisoned. The night deepens. The Atlantic swell continues its ancient rhythm. The tube remains motionless at the surface, drinking air in the dark, utterly invisible to a world that has no idea what has just been invented, no understanding of how this single piece of engineering will ripple forward through the remaining years of the war, how it will change the tactics of hunting and being hunted, how it will force navies to develop entirely new approaches to finding submarines that can no longer be tracked by the simple logic of needing to surface. This is the story of that tube. This is the story of the men who designed it, the men who built it, the men who trusted their lives to it, and the invisible war that it made possible. It begins in the dark, where all submarine stories begin, with the pressure of the water and the scarcity of air, and a desperate human need to survive by becoming, in effect, invisible. Inside the steel hull of a German-type Varick U-boat, there existed a world so compressed, so utterly sealed away from the air and light of the surface, that men who spent weeks there often returned to port speaking in whispers, as though the submarine's silence had become their own natural voice. The moment a crew member stepped through the circular hatch and descended into the control room, the world above ceased to exist in any meaningful way. What remained was a corridor of riveted metal, barely wider than a man's shoulders in places, lit by the amber glow of battery-powered lamps that cast everything in a sickly, underwater hue. The air itself was the first thing a newcomer would notice, though it would take only minutes before he stopped noticing it consciously and simply accepted it as the texture of his breathing. Diesel fumes hung in the atmosphere like an invisible fog, acrid and oily, seeping from the engines and the fuel lines that ran the length of the boat. These were not casual fumes that drifted away into open air. They accumulated, they layered. They became part of the air one pulled into the lungs with every breath, morning after morning, night after night. The smell was not entirely unpleasant to those who grew accustomed to it, though it clung to clothes and skin and hair in ways that no amount of washing could fully remove once a man returned to land. Condensation ran down the walls in constant, gentle rivulets. The temperature difference between the cool ocean outside the hull and the warmth generated by 20 or more men living in close quarters created an endless weeping of moisture that collected on every metal surface. The curved walls glistened in the lamplight. Water droplets formed on the brass fittings and the copper piping. In winter months, especially when operating in the North Atlantic, men would wake in their cramped berths, which were stacked 3 or 4 high in some sections, to find their blankets damp. In summer, the condensation became so heavy that it dripped from the overhead like a gentle, persistent rain, and the interior of the boat felt less like a vessel and more like the inside of a cave where some underground spring ran eternally. The crew developed a strange tolerance for this dampness. Their clothes were perpetually clammy, their skin never fully dried, yet somehow they adapted, the way living things do when there is no alternative but to endure. The rhythm of breathing in a submarine was not the breathing of surface life. It was slower, deeper, more deliberate. Perhaps it was the shared knowledge that the air supply was finite. that each breath represented a small subtraction from what was available. Or perhaps it was simply the physical reality that the air, already dense with diesel fumes and the exhalations of the men around them, moved through the lungs with a different quality than the boundless atmosphere of the world above. The ventilation system aboard a U-boat was efficient, far better than casual observers might imagine, but it was not infinite, and men who lived in submarines learned to breathe in a way that seemed almost ritualistic. A slow inhalation through the nose, a pause, a measured exhalation. This pattern repeated thousands of times across hours and days, creating an almost meditative undercurrent to the work of existence within the boat. When the engines were running, when the diesel motors were engaged in pushing the heavy submarine through the water, the rhythm of their operation became the heartbeat of the vessel. The percussive, mechanical thudding of the engines reverberated through the walls and through the bodies of the men who worked nearby. The sound was not loud in a way that caused discomfort, but it was present. It was always present. It became, over time, almost a comfort, because when the engines stopped, when the submarine went silent to avoid detection by the searching ears of Allied vessels above, the absence of that rhythm created a kind of acute tension. The silence was deeper, heavier, more oppressive than any absence of sound experienced in the world above. In silence, every other sound became magnified. The creak of a metal joint, the drip of condensation, the careful footfalls of men moving through passageways barely wider than their bodies. Consider the peculiar psychology of men who have never known any existence but this one. The sailors and officers who joined the U-boat service in the earliest years of the war, many of them had grown to adulthood during peacetime. They had known the feeling of standing on a dock and breathing the salt air of the North Sea. They had felt the sun on their faces. The transition to life underwater was not a gradual adjustment spread across months or years. It was a descent into an alternative world that functioned according to entirely different principles. Yet there is something remarkable about human adaptation. Within a week or two, even the most claustrophobic among them would begin to organize their thoughts around the boat's rhythms. They would stop craving open air consciously, or at least they would set that craving aside into some compartment of their mind where it could be endured without destroying their ability to function. The submarine became, in effect, home, not a temporary shelter, but a place that possessed its own logic, its own rules, its own intimate geometry. The sleeping arrangements alone represented a kind of compromise with human dignity that few people today could comprehend. In many U-boats, the crew slept in rotation on a system known as hot bunking. A man would complete his watch, climb out of his bunk, still warm from his shipmate's body, and that shipmate would immediately crawl in to sleep in the warmth left behind. There was no privacy. There was no sense of ownership over even a single cubic meter of space that belonged exclusively to oneself. Every cubic meter belonged to the boat, and the boat belonged to the war, and all of it existed in a state of careful subordination to the mission. Yet in this environment, in this apparent negation of individual comfort, something unexpected sometimes took root. Men spoke later, after the war, of a strange camaraderie that formed in submarines. Not the camaraderie of shared combat glory, or the pride of accomplished tasks, but something quieter. The camaraderie of men who had agreed, wordlessly, to endure the impossible together. The galley, the small space where the crew ate their meals, was perhaps the only place in the submarine that might have struck an observer from the surface world as almost normal. The cook, an especially valued crew member, worked miracles with limited ingredients in impossibly tight quarters. There was a certain democracy in eating, even in submarines at war. Everyone ate the same food. The captain and the lowest rating shared the same rations, though the timing of meals was staggered to ensure that someone was always on watch. The smell of cooking food, warm bread, thin stews, whatever the cook could manage, often masked, at least temporarily, the ever-present diesel fumes. For a brief window while eating, a man could almost forget that he was living inside a sealed metal tube at the bottom of the sea. But only almost, and only briefly. The radio room represented a different sensory world entirely. Here, the crew members tasked with maintaining communication had to exercise absolute quiet and concentration, monitoring the static and codes that connected them to their command structure above, to the rest of the fleet, to the abstract strategic forces that had placed them in this position. The headsets they wore isolated them slightly from the general ambient sound of the boat, creating a paradoxical experience of both greater isolation and greater connection. They could hear the larger war, in a sense, through those headsets. They could receive orders that would send the boat rushing toward targets or away from danger. But they could not share what they heard with their shipmates immediately, at least not all of it. So there was a kind of information asymmetry that ran through the boat's hierarchy. The radio men knew things. They possessed knowledge that the men in the engine room or the torpedo room did not possess. This gave them a strange status, a quiet authority that came not from rank but from access. Time moved differently in a submarine. Days and nights had no external reference. The sun did not rise or set as markers. The boat operated on a schedule that bore no necessary relationship to the Earth's rotation. For days, weeks even, the crew might work and rest according to a rhythm that was entirely artificial, created by the boat's operational needs and the watch rotations that governed everything. Some men adapted to this by simply surrendering any attempt to maintain their internal sense of time. Others fought against it, compulsively calculating how many hours of daylight they were missing, how many sunrises had occurred without their witness. The mind can only sustain that kind of counting for so long before it becomes unbearable. Eventually, men stopped thinking about the surface world in concrete terms. It became abstract, a place that existed theoretically but not practically. Their real world was the boat, and the boat had its own temporal reality. And so there existed, in the steel belly of these machines, a complete inversion of normal human existence. Men who could not see the sky learned to navigate by instruments. Men who could not feel wind on their skin learned to understand motion through the boat's response to the water around it. Men who could not breathe freely learned to breathe in measured, careful ways, never taking for granted each lungful of air that came to them, filtered through diesel fumes and condensation and the exhalations of the men beside them. None of them, in these early years of the war, could yet imagine a life removed from this reality. The submarine was not a temporary posting. It was not a brief mission undertaken with the expectation of return to a normal world. It was a way of being that had become, for them, the totality of existence. And as the war continued, as the technology that confined them evolved and developed, their ability to remain submerged would extend further and further. The time they would spend in this sealed world would grow longer. The sea would hold them more completely. There exists a peculiar kind of quietness that surrounds the history of wartime engineering, a stillness that persists even when we speak about machines built for violence, for concealment, for the desperate struggle to survive unseen. The Schnorchel was one such machine, a tube so simple in concept that it almost seems strange it took until the depths of a global war for someone to fully realize its potential. And yet, the story of this invention, the way it moved through the hands of engineers and sailors, the desperate calculations that brought it into being, these stories are rarely told with the unhurried attention they deserve. If you find yourself drawn to these narratives, to the patient unfolding of how small innovations in metal and mathematics shaped the course of hidden wars, you might consider subscribing to this channel. We spend our time here exploring the machines that operated in darkness, the inventions that few people saw but that quietly altered the balance of power beneath the waves. Each episode invites you into the engineering mind of wartime, the moment when an engineer looks at an impossible problem and begins to sketch a solution on worn paper. We move slowly through these histories, letting each detail settle, each technical breakthrough breathe, because there is something deeply restful about understanding how human ingenuity emerged not from comfort or abundance, but from constraint and fear. The stories we tell here are different. They are not the grand narratives of surface battles or famous commanders. Instead, they are the stories of the men who sat in metal tubes breathing recycled air, and the engineers who, before those men ever descended, had to solve problems that seemed to have no solution. How do you pump diesel air through the crush of the sea? How do you keep men sane in a space no larger than a coffin for weeks at a time? How do you make a machine that can hide so completely that even modern technology struggles to find it? These are the kinds of questions that occupied the minds of German and Dutch and British engineers during the 1930s and 1940s, and they are the questions that lead, eventually, to a simple tube with a valve inside it. A tube that would change everything about submarine warfare and, by extension, about the entire war beneath the Atlantic. But before we trace that path, before we follow the Schnorchel from its earliest conceptual origins through its desperate deployment in U-boats hunted across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, we ought to establish why such an invention became necessary at all. Why was there, in the years before this war began, such a pressing need to keep a submarine submerged while running its engines? What danger had emerged from the simple fact that submarines, by the very nature of their batteries and their engines, had to return to the surface to breathe? The answer lies in understanding the fundamental vulnerability that plagued every undersea vessel in the early 20th century. A submarine, beneath the waves, was nearly invisible. It was a phantom, a threat that could not be easily tracked or countered. But the moment it broke the surface, the moment that periscope rose, or those hatches opened, or those diesel engines rumbled to life while the boat sat high in the water, the submarine became visible. It became a target. And in the 1930s, particularly as the decade drew to a close and the world sensed the approach of another great conflict, new forms of detection were beginning to emerge. Aircraft, which had once been confined to observation and reconnaissance, were becoming faster, more agile, more deadly. They could spot a surfaced submarine from miles away. Radar, that strange new technology born from peacetime research into radio waves, was beginning to offer the possibility of detecting objects at night, in fog, in conditions where human eyes would see nothing. A submarine that had to surface to recharge its batteries, that had to run its engines on the surface to restore electrical power for its underwater propulsion systems. Such a submarine was increasingly vulnerable. It was like a creature that needed to come up for air in a world where every breath risked drawing the attention of a predator circling overhead. The engineers and naval commanders of various nations understood this problem intuitively, even before the first shot of the Second World War was fired. There were experiments, scattered and often secretive, conducted by the Dutch Navy, by German research facilities, by other maritime nations, all attempting to solve the same central question. Could a submarine run its diesel engines while remaining submerged? Could it somehow draw air from above the surface while staying hidden below? The solution, when it finally took form, seemed almost absurdly simple. A tube, a pipe that rose through the water to break the surface, drawing in fresh air for the diesel engines. Another tube that carried away the exhaust gases, venting them above the waves. A float valve at the top of the intake tube that would close automatically if a wave washed over it, preventing water from pouring down into the engine. It was elegant, it was ingenious, and it was, in the way of many genius ideas, obvious only once someone had thought of it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The path to the Schnorchel was not a straight line. It was a winding journey through Dutch naval laboratories, through German acquisition and adaptation, through the desperate pressure of a war that was not going as planned. And that journey, if we are patient enough to follow it, tells us something profound about how human beings respond when they are pressed into a corner, when their survival depends on innovation, when fear becomes the mother of invention in its purest sense. The story begins not with Germany, but with the Netherlands, not with fanfare or official announcements, but in the quiet spaces of naval research. And it begins with an engineer named J.J. Wichers, a man whose name has been largely forgotten by history, even though the device he helped develop would extend the U-boat threat by months, would cost lives, would reshape the entire nature of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. To understand why the Schnorchel became such a desperate necessity, we must first drift back into the basic predicament that haunted every submarine captain long before the war's urgencies demanded its invention. You see, the submarines of the 1930s, for all their steel hulls and cunning design, carried within them a fundamental contradiction that no amount of engineering could entirely resolve. They were machines that had to breathe, and breathing meant surfacing. Picture, if you will, the battery systems that powered these early boats. Beneath the deck plates, in compartments lined with lead-acid cells, thousands upon thousands of them, lay the submarine's heartbeat when submerged. These batteries were extraordinary for their time, carefully balanced and maintained by devoted crews, yet they possessed a critical weakness. They could only hold so much charge before exhaustion set in. And unlike the surface ships that could run their diesel engines continuously, a submerged submarine had no such luxury. The batteries slowly drained, the lights dimmed imperceptibly, the speed fell away, and within hours, sometimes less, depending on how hard the boat was driven, the crew faced an unavoidable choice. They had to come up. Surfacing meant exposure. It meant breaking the invisible boundary between the hidden world beneath and the watched world above, where enemy eyes might be scanning the horizon, where a patrol boat or an armed trawler could be waiting, where the very act of drawing fresh air into the boat's ventilation shafts announced your presence to anyone listening intently enough. And yet there was no alternative. The diesel engines that powered a submarine's main propulsion, those great beating hearts of metal and fuel, they could not run underwater. They were air-breathing engines, designed to gulp enormous quantities of oxygen, to burn fuel in a roaring combustion that would have poisoned the crew in seconds had it been attempted in the sealed hull of a submerged boat. So the old dance had been choreographed long before the Second War began. Submerge on battery power, run silent, run deep if danger approached, conserve every ampere hour of electrical energy, creep along at minimal speed, 5 knots perhaps, 10 at most, to preserve what remained in those cells. And then, when the batteries grew critically low and the air inside the boat grew stale and thick with carbon dioxide, when the men's eyes felt heavy and their thinking grew sluggish from the poisoned atmosphere surface, break the surface in the dark if possible, crack open the diesel engines, let them roar into life, flood the boat with that wonderful, terrible fresh air, and charge the batteries back to readiness. The vulnerability this created was not subtle. A submarine on the surface was still a submarine, still lower than a surface ship, still harder to spot in rough weather, but it was no longer a ghost. On the surface, a boat became a target. Radar, which was beginning to evolve and sharpen its capabilities in the late 1930s, could sometimes see a surfaced submarine at a considerable distance if conditions aligned properly. More immediately, a watchful eye on a passing ship or aircraft could spot the characteristic shape of a conning tower breaking the waves, and once spotted, a surfaced submarine, for all its armor and its torpedo tubes, was vulnerable to ramming, to depth charges, to coordinated attack. It had to submerge again to hide, and when it did, it had sacrificed hours of charging time that could have been used to restore its dwindling reserves. This was the prisoner's dilemma written into the physics of early submarine design. The longer you stayed submerged and hidden, the weaker you became. The longer you stayed on the surface to charge your batteries and breathe, the more exposed you were. And for submarines operating in contested waters, in the North Sea, in the Atlantic approaches, in the Mediterranean, contested waters meant exactly that. There were enemies above, always. There were patrol patterns, convoy routes, armed escorts multiplying with each year that the war progressed. A U-boat captain in 1943 could not assume safety on the surface the way a captain in 1939 might have, with perhaps somewhat less immediate threat pressing from the skies. The crew of a submerged boat felt this tension in their bones. The men who served in submarines during this era understood, with an intimacy that surface sailors never quite grasped, that their boat was fundamentally limited by this biological need for oxygen and this mechanical need for electrical charge. They could not stay down indefinitely. They could not hide forever. The ocean itself, that great concealing expanse of water, could only shield them for so long before the mathematics of their power supply forced them upward, blinking into the possibility of danger. And this limitation was not merely tactical, not merely a matter of operational frustration. It was a constraint on strategy itself. How long could a U-boat patrol last if much of that time was consumed by surfacing, by charging, by vulnerability? How far from base could it venture if it had to return when the batteries grew weak? The entire architecture of submarine warfare in the pre-war period and the early war years was built around accepting this constraint as inevitable, unchangeable, almost sacred in its immutability. Submarines were creatures of the shallows and the night, of the brief respite of darkness and fog. In daylight, in clear weather, they hid on the bottom or ran as deep as they dared, waiting for night to bring them the opportunity to rise and breathe and charge. This was the rhythm of the undersea war, the pulse that governed every captain's decisions, every engineer's calculations, every lookout's tense vigil during those precious hours on the surface when danger felt closest and the submarine felt, paradoxically, most alive. The men who dreamed of submarines breathing underwater while remaining submerged were not scientists working in gleaming laboratories. They were practical engineers, many of them working in the shipyards and naval offices of maritime nations, watching the submarine evolve with something between hope and dread. The 1930s was a time of quiet technological ferment in European naval circles, a period when nations were beginning to suspect, in their deepest institutional bones, that the next war would be unlike anything that had come before. In this atmosphere of careful experimentation and half-whispered concern, the idea of allowing a diesel engine to draw air while a submarine remained underwater began to take on a real shape. It was not a sudden invention. It was something that emerged, slowly, from the observations of men who spent their days thinking about problems that seemed almost impossible to solve. Consider for a moment the simple physics of what they were attempting to achieve. A diesel engine, even when running at minimal throttle, requires a constant, hungry breath of fresh air. It needs oxygen. A submarine running on batteries produces no exhaust, no waste gases. But a submarine running on diesel to charge those batteries, or worse, a submarine that might one day need to power itself underwater at any significant speed, that submarine faced an exquisite contradiction. How do you breathe the air that floats 100 meters above your head, in a world where your presence on the surface means death? The Dutch came to this problem first, or at least they came to it with the most serious intent. The Netherlands, a maritime power with a long tradition of naval engineering, had built a respectable submarine fleet in the years after the First World War. Their vessels were well designed, thoughtfully constructed, but like every other submarine navy in the world, they faced the same inexorable limitation. Their boats had to surface, and when they surfaced, they became visible. They became vulnerable. In the early 1930s, Dutch naval engineers and designers began to consider, with increasing seriousness, what a small tube might accomplish. A tube that extended above the surface, that drew air from the world above, funneling it down into the submarine's engine compartment. The air would pass into the diesel engine, combustion would occur, and the exhaust would need to go somewhere. But that was a problem for later thought. First, the tube itself had to be tested. First, they had to understand whether such a thing could even work. The earliest experiments were conducted in a spirit of cautious optimism mixed with deep uncertainty. Prototype tubes were fitted to small vessels, to test boats, to submarines that were perhaps already aging or of less critical operational value. The engineers would have stood in the control rooms and submarine sheds, watching as their creations were submerged, waiting to see if the simple concept would collapse under the pressure of actual seawater and the violence of actual engine operation. One can imagine the mixture of emotions, the hope that this might open a new chapter in submarine warfare, the anxiety that the whole mechanism might fail catastrophically, flooding the boat, or worse. The tests proceeded slowly. The data accumulated. And by the middle of the 1930s, the Dutch Navy had developed what they called the sniver, a word that translates, with a kind of poetic imprecision, to sniffer or snout. It was a name that captured something of its function, something of its appearance. A tube that let the submarine sniff at the air above without fully breaking the surface. The design itself, in its fundamental form, was elegant in its simplicity. The tube, hollow and cylindrical, was fitted with valves, mechanisms that could close automatically if water threatened to rush down the shaft. The exhaust gases from the engine would need to be routed somewhere, but the Dutch engineers solved this by simply venting them overboard at a point below the surface, where they would diffuse and disperse in the water. It was not perfect. Nothing in engineering ever is. But it worked well enough to constitute a genuine advancement. The sniver extended the underwater endurance of a submarine significantly. A boat equipped with the device could run its diesel engines while submerged, at least partially. It could charge its batteries while remaining underwater. It could move at speeds greater than what battery power alone permitted. It could do these things while presenting a much smaller target to any enemy watching the surface. This represented a fundamental shift in submarine capability, even if the world at large did not yet recognize it. What is perhaps most intriguing, if one permits oneself to speculate gently, is how quietly this innovation proceeded. The Dutch were not making grand announcements. This was not a technology that appeared in technical journals or naval conferences. The Dutch Navy incorporated the sniver into their submarine designs, fitted their boats with the devices, trained their crews in their operation, and largely kept the details to themselves. It was a competitive advantage, a secret held close. The ocean keeps secrets well. Secrets kept beneath the ocean keep themselves even better. Meanwhile, and largely independently, engineers in Germany were conducting their own experiments with remarkably similar ideas. The German submarine tradition was, of course, far older and far more deeply embedded in the national consciousness. Germany had invented the modern military submarine, or nearly so. The U-boat had been the terror of the Great War. Every German naval officer, every German engineer who worked with submarines, carried in their mind the memory of what submarines could accomplish. After the Treaty of Versailles had restricted German naval power, Submarine development had become one of the few areas where German naval innovation could continue. The Weimar Republic, constrained in so many ways, had permitted submarine research to proceed, and now, in the 1930s, as Hitler's government began to rearm, submarine development accelerated. German engineers, working from their own observations and their own logical reasoning about the problems of underwater propulsion, began to experiment with intake tubes, with valve systems, with methods of exhausting combustion gases while remaining submerged. Were the Germans aware of the Dutch work? It is likely that some indication of Dutch experiments reached German naval circles through the ordinary channels of technical intelligence and professional naval gossip. The naval world, even when divided by national boundaries, is a small and interconnected place. Engineers read other engineers' work. Naval attachés observe and report. Rumors circulate. But the German experiments proceeded largely on their own conceptual track. They were not copying, they were solving the same problem independently, as two mathematicians working in separate rooms might arrive at similar solutions to an identical equation. This parallel development, this convergence of engineering thought across borders and in isolation, speaks to something fundamental about how technology emerges from genuine need. When the conditions are right, when the problem is real and pressing, when the knowledge base exists to attempt a solution, similar ideas tend to arise in multiple places at roughly similar times. It is as if the problem itself, once clearly perceived, contains within it the seeds of its own answer. The Schnorchel was not the invention of one man or one nation. It was the inevitable response of multiple maritime powers to a problem that any submarine navy had to confront. By the late 1930s, as the decade drew to its close and war seemed less a distant possibility and more an approaching certainty, both the Dutch and the Germans possessed working snorkel systems. Neither power yet fully understood how these tubes would reshape underwater warfare. Neither fully grasped, in those final years before the world caught fire, that they held in their hands a technology that would extend the submarine war by months, perhaps longer. The Schnorchel was ready. The ocean was ready. The war, when it came, was ready too, but none of them knew it yet. And so it was that in the quieter corners of European naval engineering, far from the loud certainties of battleship doctrine and the public spectacle of naval parades, a Dutch engineer named J.J. Wickers began to ask a question that would eventually reshape the submarine forever. In the 1930s, while the great powers built their visible fleets and argued over treaties, Wickers worked in relative obscurity for the Royal Netherlands Navy, turning his attention to a problem that had troubled submarine designers for decades: the fundamental conflict between needing air to run a diesel engine and needing to remain hidden beneath the surface. It was an elegant problem, the kind that might have preoccupied him during long, methodical evenings in his workshop, surrounded by brass fittings and technical drawings that few outside his circle would ever see. The Dutch, as a maritime nation with long experience in submarine development, had invested considerably in understanding underwater warfare. They were not a great military power, but they understood the sea the way certain peoples do, as a neighbor you must live alongside and never fully predict. Wickers recognized that the submarines of his era were caught in a terrible bind, forced to surface regularly like whales to breathe, and in that moment of breath lay all their vulnerability. What if, he began to conceive, there could be a way for a submarine to inhale from above the surface while remaining mostly submerged? Not a revolutionary idea, perhaps, but one requiring patient engineering innovation to make it work reliably. By the mid-1930s, Wickers had developed what the Dutch Navy would eventually call the sniver, a word meaning snorkel or snout in Dutch, wonderfully descriptive in its simplicity. The device was, in concept, a tube that extended from inside the submarine's pressure hull upward through the conning tower and just above the waterline, allowing diesel air intake to draw fresh air from the atmosphere even while the boat remained nearly submerged. It sounds straightforward now, but the engineering required to make it function safely, to prevent water from rushing down the tube during rough seas, to route exhaust properly, and to ensure that the crew below would not perish from inhaling contaminated air or explosive fuel vapors. These were challenges that demanded meticulous design and patient testing. The Dutch Navy, perhaps mindful of the coming storm gathering on the European horizon, quietly adopted the Schnorchel into their submarine fleet. They did not announce it proudly or publish detailed technical papers. This was the kind of innovation that remained largely hidden, discussed in official naval circles but not broadcast to the world. There was something almost melancholic about this quiet adoption, a small nation quietly preparing itself, knowing that defensive innovations might one day determine survival. The Dutch submarines equipped with snoovers represented a modest but significant step forward, allowing extended underwater operations and reducing the frequency of dangerous surface time. For a brief window, the Dutch Navy possessed a technological advantage that many larger naval powers had overlooked or dismissed as impractical. One might pause here and wonder what historical threads depend on such quiet moments. If witches had not pursued this idea with such dedication, if the Dutch Navy had not chosen to adopt and refine his design, if the technical problems had proven too difficult to solve, how different might the next decade have unfolded? The question hangs unanswered, as most counterfactual speculations do, but it reminds us that great historical transformations often begin in workshops and design offices, where a single engineer's conviction and patience can reshape what becomes possible. By 1939, as the war began and the European map started its violent redrawing, several Dutch submarines had already been fitted with snorkels. They carried this technological seed with them, unaware, most of them, that they were harboring an innovation that would soon be discovered by those who would use it to wage an even more ferocious campaign beneath the Atlantic. The Dutch Navy itself would soon be overwhelmed by invasion, its submarines hunted and sunk or forced to flee. But the idea, that fragile, carefully engineered idea, would survive. It would be seized upon, studied, improved, and transformed into something far more formidable than Vickers might have initially imagined when he first sketched its basic form. There is something worth observing in how technological innovation moves through history. It is not always the great powers that light the way forward. Sometimes a smaller nation, with fewer resources but more desperate need to think clearly, will advance human knowledge in directions others have overlooked. The Dutch contribution to submarine technology would persist long after the Dutch Navy itself had ceased to play any independent role in the war. This is one of the strange mercies of history, that ideas, once released into the world, cannot easily be suppressed or forgotten, no matter what empires rise or fall around them. They travel, they transform, they find new hosts and new uses, and they continue their quiet work long after their originators have moved on to other concerns. The spring of 1940 arrived across Europe with a speed that left most military planners breathless, their carefully drawn strategic maps already obsolete before the ink had dried. In May, German forces swept through the Low Countries with a swiftness that surprised even themselves. And among the many prizes claimed in those early weeks of conquest was something far smaller than territory, yet immensely significant to those who understood the hidden mechanics of naval warfare. When Dutch ports fell to German control, the Dutch Navy found itself in an impossible position. The nation occupied, its surface fleet either scuttled or evacuated, and yet beneath the water, in the naval yards and submarine depots, there remained vessels and technologies that the conquering forces were only beginning to fully appreciate. The Dutch, you see, had been thinking about the problem of submerged operation for some time. They were a maritime nation, surrounded by the sea, dependent upon it, and they had invested intellectual energy into making their submarines more capable, more persistent, more able to remain hidden beneath the waves for extended periods. When German naval officers and engineers began their careful examination of captured Dutch submarine assets and documentation, they encountered something that would, in time, alter the trajectory of their entire U-boat campaign. Among the technical drawings and specifications, there existed a design for an air intake system, that simple yet revolutionary apparatus, known as the snoever, the Dutch word resonating with something close to sniff or snort, capturing in its very name the image of a vessel drawing breath through a straw while submerged. The initial reactions were mixed. Some German officers recognized immediately what this meant. It meant their U-boats would no longer be forced to surface so frequently, no longer be imprisoned by the absolute necessity of bringing diesel engines above the waterline to gulp the air they desperately needed. Others saw only a curiosity, an interesting technical novelty, but nothing that would fundamentally change the nature of submarine warfare. Yet there was a growing minority among the German engineering corps and U-boat command staff who understood that they were looking at something precious, a potential answer to a problem that was becoming increasingly urgent as the war in the Atlantic deepened and the technical sophistication of British and later American anti-submarine forces continued to evolve. Consider the timing of this discovery through another lens. In 1940, the U-boat campaign was still in its early phases, operating under rules and assumptions that would prove increasingly obsolete. German submarines could still hunt with relative impunity on the surface, still approach convoys with a freedom that seemed almost luxurious in comparison to what would come later. The threats were present, certainly, but they were manageable. Aircraft from land bases, occasionally escort vessels, but nothing yet approaching the coordinated, radar-guided, relentless machinery of defense that would characterize the latter half of the war. The Germans could afford, for a moment, to be cautious about adopting new technologies, to test them thoroughly, to consider whether the benefits truly outweighed the complexities of retrofitting an entire fleet. But captured documentation does something powerful in the minds of military engineers and planners. It transforms an abstract theoretical possibility into a concrete achieved reality. Someone else had already solved this problem. Someone else had built it, tested it, understood its parameters and its limitations. The Dutch design represented not merely an idea, but a proof of concept, and that distinction made all the difference. German naval engineers began a careful study of the captured Dutch equipment and the technical specifications surrounding its operation. They examined the valve mechanism, studied how the air intake tube was positioned and sealed, investigated the routing of exhaust gases, and most importantly, they began to envision how such a system might be adapted, refined, and integrated into their own U-boat designs. What occurred over the following months was a process that blended theft and innovation in equal measure. The Germans were not simply copying the Dutch design, though there were certainly elements of that. They were taking the fundamental concept and reimagining it for their own purposes, their own boat designs, their own operational requirements. Kriegsmarine engineers in Berlin and in the various U-boat construction yards began to collaborate with officials from the occupied Dutch territories, extracting knowledge both through cooperation and through the simple power of conquest. There were, in particular, conversations with Dutch naval and technical specialists who either chose to collaborate or found themselves in positions where collaboration seemed the most prudent course available to them. The designation that the Germans would eventually apply to their version of this device was the Schnorchel, a word laden with the same sense of a vessel sniffing, breathing, drawing sustenance from above while remaining submerged below. It was a term that would come to carry enormous weight in the naval archives of multiple nations, whispered in the operations rooms of U-boat commanders who understood that this simple innovation might mean the difference between a successful patrol and a coffin at the bottom of the Atlantic. But in 1940, it was still merely a possibility, a technical exercise, something to be tested and refined and integrated into larger plans that were still being formed. There is something poignant in contemplating this moment of technological transfer, this point at which an invention born from the pragmatic thinking of Dutch engineers found itself absorbed into the military-industrial machinery of Nazi Germany. The Dutch had created something designed to serve their own strategic interests, their own vision of naval power in the North Sea and beyond. And then, almost immediately, the context of its use was transformed entirely, reoriented toward purposes none of its original creators could have fully anticipated. This is one of the strange truths of wartime innovation. Technologies develop their own momentum, their own trajectory through history, independent of the intentions of those who first conceived them. By the end of 1940, German naval planners had decided that the Schnorchel principle was worth serious development, that the resources required to refine it and integrate it into their U-boat fleet were justified by the potential strategic gains. The decision would not be implemented immediately. Such transitions in naval design and construction take months and years of planning, coordination, and gradual implementation. But the intellectual commitment had been made. The captured Dutch technology had been recognized not as a curiosity or a sidelight, but as something central to the future of the U-boat war. The Germans had glimpsed a possible future in which their submarines might operate with less vulnerability, less desperation, less dependence on those dangerous moments when they had to break the surface and expose themselves to the sky and whatever threats might emerge from it. In that moment of recognition, in those quiet conversations between German engineers and their Dutch counterparts or their German colleagues, the seeds were planted for a technological transformation that would reshape the final years of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had become something very different from the dark hunting ground it had been for Germany's U-boat fleet just 2 years before. Where once a German submarine commander could surface at twilight, run on diesel engines to make distance and recharge depleted batteries with relative safety, that window of vulnerability had begun to close with a speed that few naval strategists had fully anticipated. The sea itself hadn't changed, but the eyes watching it had multiplied and sharpened, and this transformation would force the hands of German engineers toward a solution they were only beginning to understand they desperately needed. Consider what the surface meant to a U-boat captain in those earlier years. The ocean offered freedom there, the ability to cruise at 10 or 12 knots, to see the horizon unobstructed, to draw air that wasn't recycled and fouled by 50 men's breathing and the engine's own exhaust. Submerged, a boat could move at perhaps 6 knots on battery power alone, and even that meager speed consumed the electrical charge needed for life itself. The batteries were massive, occupying nearly a third of the vessel's internal volume, and they exhausted themselves with mechanical inevitability. To survive, a U-boat had to surface. To surface, it had to accept a certain risk. For years, that risk had been manageable, even small. By 1943, it had become something else entirely. The Allies had been quietly revolutionizing their detection capabilities throughout 1942 and into 1943, and the Germans, despite their considerable intelligence networks, were slower to grasp the full scope of what they were facing. The primary instrument of this revolution was something called centimeter wave radar, a technical leap forward that the British had pioneered and the Americans had rapidly adopted. Earlier radar systems operated at longer wavelengths, visible to German detection receivers if one knew how to listen for them. But this new radar broadcast on wavelengths so short, so densely packed, that existing German detector equipment couldn't perceive it at all. To a U-boat commander, it was as though a new predator had arrived in the hunting grounds overnight, invisible in a way that previous threats had never been. And the predators came from above. Imagine the mathematics of this vulnerability from the submariner's perspective. A surfaced U-boat presented a small target from a distance, yes, but from directly overhead, from the air, it became something closer to a sitting mark. The Allies had integrated their new radar into increasingly sophisticated aircraft, particularly the American B-24 Liberator and the British consolidated Catalina. These long-range patrol aircraft could cruise the Atlantic with an endurance that older planes simply lacked, and they could coordinate with convoy escorts in ways that created layered, intelligent defenses. A surfaced U-boat could potentially outrun a surface warship, but it couldn't outrun an aircraft already bearing down on it. What emerged across 1942 and intensified through early 1943 was a subtle but profound shift in the balance of power. The tonnage of Allied shipping that U-boats could sink remained significant. Vast, even, but the cost in terms of U-boats lost began to climb in ways that the German Naval Command found increasingly difficult to justify. Boats that would have once spent several weeks on station, surfacing frequently to reposition or hunt, now found themselves forced to spend longer periods submerged, rationing their battery capacity, choosing patrol areas more conservatively. The hunting was becoming nervous. The freedom was evaporating. Every U-boat captain operating in the Atlantic by mid-1943 would have absorbed this reality through the accumulating weight of orders and reports. Fleet commanders were issuing directives that subtly reflected the new truth. Recommendations to avoid certain patrol zones where aircraft activity had intensified, warnings about increased daylight surface attacks, suggestions to remain submerged as much as possible during daylight hours, resuming surface operations only under cover of darkness. These recommendations carried with them an implicit acknowledgement. The surface was no longer safe, but remaining submerged indefinitely was impossible with existing technology. The U-boats were caught between two imperatives, and the tension between them was tightening. What's perhaps most striking, looking back across the years with all our accumulated knowledge, is how this crisis didn't announce itself suddenly. It accumulated gradually, operationally, in a series of incremental losses and narrowed options that eventually described a pattern almost too large for the command structure to acknowledge all at once. A boat lost here, another forced to abort a patrol there, a captain reporting that surface approaches had become suicidally risky, a convoy that shouldn't have survived, surviving. The texture of the U-boat war was shifting beneath the surface of official reports, and by early 1943, the contradiction had become impossible to ignore. German naval leadership understood, with the cold clarity that comes from observing your own casualties mount, that something fundamental had to change. The submarines themselves were sound designs. The crews were experienced and determined, but the operational environment had moved decisively against them, and no amount of tactical adjustment could overcome that fundamental constraint. They needed to either leave the battle entirely, which was politically and strategically unthinkable, or they needed to find a way to operate that transcended the old choice between battery exhaustion and aerial vulnerability. They needed, in other words, to stay underwater longer without sacrificing the power that only diesel engines could provide. They needed, though few in the German technical establishment would have known to use the phrase, a Schnorchel. What made this realization particularly poignant, what gave it weight beyond mere technical problem-solving, was that the solution already existed, in fragmentary form, in the technical knowledge available to German engineering. The pieces were there, waiting. It would take pressure, urgency, and the particular kind of creative desperation that comes from having no other real options, but the path forward was there, obscured perhaps, but real. The Atlantic, with its radar-swept skies and its invisible electronic hunters, was already transforming itself into the birthplace of an innovation that would alter the entire trajectory of the U-boat war's final chapters. But in the spring of 1943, German commanders could only sense the problem clearly. The solution remained on the far side of engineering challenges and production delays and the cumulative friction of wartime manufacture. They would need to reach for it, and reaching for it would demand every bit of technical sophistication their naval engineering establishment could muster. The mechanics themselves were deceptively elegant, almost poetic in their simplicity, though their engineering demanded precision that measured life and death in centimeters of water and fractions of a second. At its core, the Schnorchel was fundamentally a tube, a raised air intake that extended from the submarine's interior through its pressure hull and up through the hull's outer skin to breach the surface of the sea, or hover just barely above it, allowing a submarine to draw fresh air while remaining submerged. The diesel engines that powered the U-boat's propulsion required oxygen, always oxygen, more oxygen than any human lungs could provide, and this simple fact had been the submarine's greatest vulnerability. But now, by threading a breathing tube through the dark water, the engineers had devised a way for the boat to breathe without surfacing, to remain hidden while still drawing the air its engines demanded. The system required several interconnected components, each one essential, each one subject to the relentless pressures of depth and saltwater corrosion. The intake pipe itself rose from somewhere along the submarine's hull, typically near the conning tower, a slender metal column, perhaps 3 to 4 inches in diameter, running at an angle toward the surface. This was not merely a simple pipe open to the sky, for such a design would have flooded the boat the moment a wave washed over the opening, or during those inevitable moments when the submarine dipped slightly deeper and water covered the mouth of the tube. Instead, the tip of the Schnorchel was equipped with a float valve, a mechanism as humble and mechanical as it was crucial, a hollow ball or buoyant disc suspended inside the pipe's opening. When water touched this float, when even the gentlest wave began to rise over the intake, the buoyancy principle did its work. The water pressure pushed the float upward, and as it rose, it closed a valve, sealing the opening. Oxygen flowed no longer, the engine intake cut off, and the submarine, for those seconds or minutes, ran on the last breath of air already inside the hull. This float mechanism was perhaps the greatest source of tension aboard a Schnorchel-equipped boat, though the men living with it rarely spoke of their anxiety in technical terms. They felt it instead as a clenching in the chest, a hyper-awareness of the engine's sound, a listening for the sudden silence that meant water had found its way past the valve. For the valve would stick, especially in rough seas, and when a valve stuck in the closed position, the diesel engines continued to run, consuming the air that remained trapped inside the pressure hull. The air pressure within would begin to drop as the engines pulled in every available molecule of oxygen, a process called vacuum formation, and a human being standing in such an environment would feel their eardrums pressing inward, would feel an expansion in their sinuses, as if their very skull was being compressed from the outside. The crew's ears would pop, again and again, as they moved through the submarine's compartments where pressure gradients differed slightly. Some men described it as feeling like they were ascending a mountain while standing perfectly still. When the valve was functioning properly, when it opened and closed with the gentle rhythm of the sea's breath, the Schnorchel created a circuit of air. Diesel fumes and exhaust gases, the byproducts of combustion from the engines, had to go somewhere. They could not simply accumulate inside the hull, poisoning the atmosphere that 70, 80, sometimes 90 men depended upon. So the Schnorchel served a dual purpose. The intake pipe drew in fresh Atlantic air, drawn down through the submarine's interior to the diesel engines themselves, where combustion happened, and then the exhaust, the carbon monoxide, the soot, the heat-laden products of burning fuel, had to be expelled. This exhaust was typically routed through a separate channel within the Schnorchel structure, running parallel to the intake, creating an odd bilateral system where fresh air ascended and waste air descended within the same slender metal column. Or in some designs, the exhaust was vented through an entirely separate tube, running along the hull's exterior, creating a redundancy that offered some margin of safety. The German engineers understood that if the exhaust backed up, if it had nowhere to go, the engines would simply stop. Diesel engines are impatient with resistance. The integration of this system into the boat's internal architecture required extensive modifications, particularly in the engine room, where the greatest pressures, both mechanical and thermal, were concentrated. The intake air had to be drawn through the pressure hull, which meant cutting a hole, sealing it carefully, ensuring that the pathway from the surface down into the submarine's depths was perfectly watertight. A single thread of seawater following that path in the wrong moment could pour into the submarine with the force of the entire ocean behind it. The engineers designing these systems had to think in terms of failure modes, in terms of what happens when something goes wrong, and in the environment of the North Atlantic, things regularly did go wrong. Corrosion, the slow molecular betrayal of metal when exposed to salt water, was a constant threat. The Schnorchel intake, exposed to both air and spray and the occasional submersion, would rust from the outside inward, the metal weakening grain by grain. The valve mechanisms, too, corroded slowly, their moving parts becoming stiffer, their response times lengthening. A valve that once opened instantly might, after weeks at sea, require a few extra seconds, and in those few extra seconds, the air pressure inside the hull might drop enough to cause physiological stress, enough to make a man's vision blur slightly, enough to make concentration falter. The exhaust routing presented its own engineering puzzles. The gases emerging from diesel combustion are hot, sometimes extremely hot, and they carry with them particulate matter and moisture. If the exhaust channel was not properly insulated, or if the geometry was not carefully designed, that moisture could condense inside the pipe, forming little pools of oily water that would gradually accumulate. These pools would restrict the flow of exhaust, increasing back pressure against the engines, and eventually, if left unchecked, they could create blockages that would force the engines to shut down. So the Schnorchel required maintenance, regular maintenance, even while submerged. The crew had to understand the system's weak points, had to listen for changes in engine sound that might indicate the valve was sticking, had to be prepared to perform repairs in spaces so cramped that only one man could fit, working by flashlight in an environment where a single mistake could be fatal. Consider for a moment the elegance of the design. Despite its fragility, it was an open system, in a sense, connected to the infinite ocean above, and yet it allowed the submarine to maintain the sealed integrity of its pressure hull. It was a compromise between two seemingly incompatible requirements. The submarine needed to remain hidden and submerged, yet its engines needed access to the oxygen-rich air above the surface. The Schnorchel bridged that gap with a simplicity that masked tremendous engineering insight. The system worked not through complexity, but through understanding the fundamental principles of buoyancy, pressure, flow, and the physics of water itself. It was as if the German designers had listened to the sea and learned to speak its language. But even as the Schnorchel began its quiet transformation of U-boat operations, the engineers and crews who depended on it soon discovered that the device, for all its ingenious simplicity, harbored vulnerabilities that would become sources of constant, grinding concern. Vulnerabilities that revealed themselves not in dramatic moments of catastrophe, but in the slow accumulation of small failures, each one wearing at the nerves of men already living on the knife's edge of survival. The valve mechanism itself, that critical float-operated flapper meant to snap shut when seawater threatened to pour down the intake shaft, became one of the Schnorchel's greatest sources of frustration. In the harsh, salt-laden environment of the Atlantic, where U-boats often operated in rough seas, the valve would sometimes stick in the open position, corroded by salt deposits or jammed by accumulated debris and algae. A U-boat commander might order the vessel to submerge slightly to travel beneath an observed convoy, only to discover that the valve refused to close, leaving the intake pipe open to the churning ocean above. In those moments, the captain had to make an instantaneous calculation, continue at reduced depth and risk water ingress, or surface immediately, exposing the vessel to the very threat the maneuver was designed to escape. These were not leisurely decisions made with the benefit of time. They were split-second choices made in darkness, with lives hanging in the balance. When seawater did manage to enter the system, whether through a stuck valve, a wave washing over the boat during rough weather, or simply through the inevitable microgaps that human engineering could never entirely seal, the consequences rippled through the submarine's interior like a silent warning. Water would spill into the diesel engine's air intake, and if the quantity was sufficient, the engine would cough, sputter, and momentarily stall. The crew would experience a jarring loss of propulsion, a sickening lurch of vulnerability, before engineers could rapidly shift to battery power or clear the water from the intake lines. Imagine being crammed in a steel tube, already hyper-aware of the crushing pressure outside, when suddenly, the very engine meant to keep you moving becomes unreliable, becomes a liability. The psychological toll of such moments cannot be easily quantified, but it carved itself into the muscle memory of every man who served. The water ingress problem had another, more insidious dimension. When seawater entered the Schnorchel system and mixed with the diesel exhaust gases, it created a corrosive slurry that accelerated the deterioration of the internal metal components, the pipes, the valves, the exhaust routing systems. This meant that the device required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant small repairs that consumed the limited time and resources available to a U-boat crew already stretched thin by the demands of warfare. A man assigned to inspect and clean the Schnorchel's internal passages was performing work that few would volunteer for, crawling through narrow tubes that smelled of salt, oil, and exhaust, knowing that a sudden dive or a wave crest could trap him or flood his workspace with alarming speed. But perhaps the most dangerous challenge, the one that crews spoke of in hushed, almost superstitious tones, was the problem of carbon monoxide poisoning. As the diesel engine operated while the U-boat remained submerged, exhaust gases had to be routed out of the boat through the Schnorchel's exhaust shaft. When this system functioned perfectly, the carbon monoxide, that odorless, invisible killer, would exit the boat and dissipate harmlessly into the ocean. But when design flaws or operational errors caused even minute quantities of exhaust to leak back into the submarine's interior, or when the exhaust routing became partially blocked by ice formation in the upper reaches of the tube, something that happened with alarming frequency in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, carbon monoxide would begin to accumulate in the submarine's atmosphere. A man breathing carbon monoxide has no way of knowing it. There is no smell, no taste, no immediate sensation of alarm. Instead, poisoning advances through stages so subtle that a crew member might attribute his symptoms to fatigue, to the simple exhaustion of life underwater. First comes a mild headache, barely noticeable amidst the constant ache of tension that grips a submarine crew. Then, perhaps, a slight dizziness, a momentary confusion, a feeling that his thoughts are moving more slowly than they should. By the time these symptoms became obvious enough to warrant concern, Sometimes the damage was already being done, to his cognitive function, to his ability to respond quickly in an emergency, potentially to his very survival. German submarine commanders and their medical officers became acutely aware of this danger, and some U-boats began to carry simple carbon monoxide detection equipment. Nothing sophisticated by modern standards, but enough to sound a warning before concentrations became life-threatening. Yet the presence of such equipment was itself a reminder of the danger, a silent acknowledgement that the Schnorchel, for all its strategic value, was a device that demanded respect and constant caution. What happened when a detector malfunctioned? What happened if a crew member forgot to check it during a long submerged transit? These were questions that hung in the air of every U-boat equipped with the device. The cumulative effect of these engineering challenges was a form of stress that accumulated gradually, almost imperceptibly, in the bodies and minds of U-boat crews. Each problem, the sticky valve, the threat of water ingress, the invisible danger of carbon monoxide, represented a small negotiation with risk, a small acceptance of hazard, in exchange for the tactical advantage the Schnorchel provided. And over the course of a long patrol, sometimes lasting weeks or months, these small negotiations added up to something far more profound, a deep, almost existential weariness that came not from dramatic moments of crisis, but from the knowledge that at any moment, any of these systems could fail in ways that might be subtle, might be fatal, and would certainly be beyond a man's ability to predict or prevent. The moment a U-boat commander ordered the Schnorchel raised and the diesel engines engaged while the boat remained submerged, something fundamental shifted in the crew's experience of war. Days that had once been punctuated by the necessity to surface, brief windows of frantic air exchange and battery charging, now stretched into something altogether different. The men who served in these steel tubes began to inhabit a state of being that had no real precedent in naval history. The possibility of remaining beneath the waves not for hours, but for weeks, with only a thin pipe connecting them to the world above. Imagine the subtle cognitive shift that must have taken place. A U-boat that previously could stay submerged for perhaps 12 hours now could theoretically remain down for as long as fuel and provisions allowed. The psychological architecture of the day changed entirely. Where once there had been a rhythm of descent and ascent, of diving and surfacing, of that momentary relief when hatches opened to the night air, there was now only the continuous, monotonous presence of the boat itself. Down, always down. The darkness no longer temporary but permanent. The artificial light from bare bulbs no longer a brief reprieve, but the only illumination they would know for days on end. The sensory deprivation crept in slowly, so gradually that many crew members may not have consciously registered it until weeks into a patrol. The ocean above pressed against the hull with an almost physical weight. No stars visible through a periscope in the dead of night. No wind. No spray on the face during those precious moments when a lookout could stand in the tower and feel something other than steel and humidity around them. The sea, which had always been somehow alive and variable and present, became an abstraction, something knowable only through gauges and hydrophone reports, and the occasional metallic ping that might be a merchant vessel or might be nothing at all. The air itself transformed. Yes, the Schnorchel allowed diesel engines to draw fresh oxygen while the boat remained submerged, but that fresh air came down a single narrow tube, mixing almost immediately with the accumulated warmth and exhalation of 50 men living in a space barely larger than a residential apartment. The diesel fumes, acrid, persistent, almost tangible, would have settled into every surface, into clothing, into the very membranes of the throat and lungs. Crew members reported a peculiar taste that developed after days of breathing recycled diesel particulates and human breath and the vague chemical staleness that accumulated in any enclosed space where the same air circled again and again. Consider what happened to the internal clock when there was no dawn and no dusk. The boat operated on a rigid schedule, the watch rotations that kept men at their stations, the designated meal times that broke the day into manageable pieces. But these were social constructs imposed on a darkness that never changed. Some historians suggest that many U-boat men on extended Schnorchel patrols began to experience a peculiar form of temporal disorientation. Days blurred together. A week felt like 3 weeks. The brain, adapted over millennia to recognize and respond to the sun's journey across the sky, had nothing to work with except artificial lights and wristwatches and the formal announcements of the watch officers. The silence was perhaps the most profound shift in the daily experience. Yes, a submerged submarine was never truly silent. There was always the hum of the diesel engines when the Schnorchel was operating, the whisper of the ventilation system, the occasional groan of the hull as pressures shifted. But compared to the surface world, compared even to the sound of the boat rising through water with its ballast tanks venting, it was nearly soundless. The men learned to move quietly out of habit and necessity, learned to communicate in low voices, learned to exist in an environment where unexpected noise could mean discovery and death. The absence of the ambient sounds of the surface world, the wind, the slap of water against the hull above the waterline, the occasional seabird cry, created a vacuum that human ears and minds seemed to fill with their own imaginings. One can only speculate, gently, about what this did to the psychology of men who had already volunteered for something as claustrophobic and dangerous as submarine service. The younger sailors, who had never known anything but the war, might have adapted more readily to this new permanence of submersion. But the veterans, the men who had served on earlier U-boats and remembered the surface air, may have experienced the extended Schnorchel patrols as a kind of slow suffocation of the spirit, even as the technical innovation was clearly extending their operational range and their chances of survival. The crew developed routines within the routine. Certain men gravitated to certain spaces, the radio operators in their small compartment, the engine room mechanics monitoring the diesel operation, the torpedo men tending their weapons in the forward compartment. These informal territories became psychological anchors in a boat where there was no privacy, no personal space, nowhere to be truly alone. A sailor might sit in the same spot on a bench for hours, staring at nothing, or reading one of the handful of books that circulated through the crew, wearing the pages soft with repeated handling. Others slept in shifts on bunks that were often still warm from the man who had just left them, still carrying the heat and the smell of his body. The food took on a strange significance in this context. The U-boat galleys, overseen by skilled cooks who worked minor miracles with preserved provisions and tinned goods, became nearly sacred spaces. A good meal, or what passed for good in the confined quarters of a boat running on diesel and desperation, provided not just nutrition, but a moment of normalcy, of comfort, a brief sensory experience that was not defined by fumes and darkness and the constant awareness of thousands of tons of water pressing down. The smell of food being prepared, the taste of something warm on the tongue, the simple social act of men gathering to eat together, these became their connection to a world that seemed to be slipping away above them. And there was always the sound of the sea itself, carried through the hull in ways that experienced submariners learned to interpret. A distant rumble might be a merchant convoy. A particular sort of oscillation might indicate a destroyer overhead, pinging with its sonar, searching. The Schnorchel did not make U-boats invisible or undetectable. It simply allowed them to hide and move more efficiently, to stretch their operational range and their endurance. But with that extension came a deeper immersion into an alien environment, a descent into a kind of sensory prison that was perhaps the true cost of the innovation, the price paid not in metal or fuel, but in the erosion of the human senses and the human need for variation and space, and the simple experience of dawn. And so the U-boat became not a vessel, but a kind of womb. A pressed steel chamber where daylight was a concept men could barely remember. The Schnorchel had changed the mathematics of survival, yes, but it had also changed something deeper, the inner architecture of what it meant to be enclosed, to breathe in darkness, to know that above you lay a world armed and searching, and that below there was only the patient weight of the Atlantic itself. In those first weeks of extended Schnorchel operations, the crews would have noticed it, a shift in their perception of time itself. Without the rhythm of surfacing and diving, without the relative freedom of a brief glimpse of horizon, submersion began to feel less like a tactical action and more like a state of being. 18 hours became 24, became 36, and the men inside learned to measure their lives not in hours, but in the slow rotation of the air handlers, the metronomic pulse of the diesel engines breathing down the snorkel shaft, drawing invisible oxygen from a surface they could no longer see. The darkness was absolute, not the darkness of a moonless night, which the human eye might eventually penetrate, but a darkness so complete that it felt almost tangible, almost like something pressing against the skin. The only illumination came from small electric bulbs set flush in the steel walls, casting a sickly amber glow that somehow made the shadows deeper by contrast. A man lying in his bunk, crammed shoulder to shoulder with another man in that narrow metal coffin, would have stared into a darkness so familiar that it eventually felt like home. Can you imagine that strangeness? To feel safer in confinement than in freedom. And yet the records, the fragmentary diaries and interviews that survived, suggest that was precisely what happened. The psychological mind adapts to pressure in ways the body cannot always follow. Fatigue became a companion so constant that the men almost stopped noticing it. Not the dramatic collapse of exhaustion, but a low, persistent fog that settled into the bones and the thinking. The air handlers cycled endlessly, drawing and recycling the same stale breath that had already passed through a dozen other men's lungs. Carbon dioxide, despite the scrubber's best efforts, accumulated in slow, invisible layers. The body's chemistry shifts under such conditions. Cortisol levels rise, the sleep cycle fractures, meals taste of nothing and salt. A man might fall asleep during a routine check of instruments, his head dropping forward, only to jerk awake a moment later with a confused anxiety that he'd somehow failed in his duty. The senior officers understood this. They rotated the men whenever they could, though there was never truly enough time, never truly enough rest. The Schnorchel demanded constant vigilance. A rogue wave could slap the intake valve shut, flooding seawater into the engine compartment, and every man knew it. Conversations grew strange in that environment, not hostile usually, but subdued, whispered, almost sacred in their quietness. Men who had known each other for months sometimes discovered they didn't actually know the sound of each other's normal speaking voice, because normal voices seemed vulgar, too loud, too much. They communicated in murmurs, in gesture, in the subtle language of men who had learned that sound carried differently through pressurized air. There was a strange intimacy to it, a peculiar closeness that came not from friendship, necessarily, but from shared endurance. They were breathing the same recycled air, hearing the same engine drone, watching the same pale bulbs flicker with identical concern. In wartime accounts, officers sometimes noted a kind of stillness that came over crews after a week or two of Schnorchel running, not depression exactly, but a settling into something quieter than normal human consciousness, a yielding to the rhythm of hidden motion. And this is where something almost paradoxical emerges from the records. Despite the danger, despite the grinding discomfort, despite the fact that every man aboard knew the water above him was being swept by radar and sonar, many of them, or so their accounts suggest, found a strange comfort in the constant movement beneath the surface. The Schnorchel permitted the U-boat to move almost continuously, no longer forced to surface, no longer exposed to the predatory gaze of Allied aircraft. As long as the engine ran, as long as the snorkel remained undetected, there was motion. And motion, paradoxically, felt like safety. The submarine became not a hiding place, but a living thing, breathing and moving through darkness toward. Toward what? Most of them couldn't say. But the motion itself became meditative, hypnotic even. The watch officers would stand silent in the control room, hands resting on cold metal, eyes watching the needle dials as they had watched them 10,000 times before. The chief engineer would listen, actually listen, with an intensity that bordered on mystical, to the precise vibration of the diesel engines, learning to sense in the tremor of the shaft whether the machines were content, whether they needed adjustment. The men would sleep in shifts, bodies warm against one another in those torpedo tube berths, and when they woke, they would return to their stations as if they had never truly been asleep at all, only paused, like a piece of music, waiting for the next bar. There was, in those accounts that hint at the psychological reality, a strange kind of peace underneath the fear. Not peace, perhaps, but a settling into inevitability. The men couldn't surface. The war was somewhere above, but down here, in this sealed world, there was only the present moment, only the engine's breath, only the slow, dark circle of time repeating itself, hour after hour. One crew member, a petty officer whose name has been lost to history, though his account survives, described it as being no longer living in the war, but living inside the war, the way a fish lives inside the sea. Not trying to escape it, just existing within it. This psychological adaptation was as much a part of the Schnorchel's legacy as its technical specifications. It wasn't the invention that saved the U-boats in those final years, not entirely. It was the resilience of the men inside them, learning to become something other than themselves, something patient, something attentive, something capable of enduring the pressure of depth and confinement, and the knowledge of constant, invisible pursuit. The human mind is remarkably plastic under duress. It finds ways to settle, to accept, even to find meaning in the most confining circumstances. As the technology matured through the middle years of the war, the Schnorchel began its slow transformation from experimental curiosity into operational reality. The Type Phi U-boat, that workhorse of the Atlantic campaign, was never designed with the Schnorchel in mind, yet it would become the vessel's most vital lifeline when retrofitting began in earnest during 1943 and into the final months of conflict. Engineers faced the peculiar problem of grafting new capability onto an already cramped hull that had been optimized for everything except this kind of extended submerged diesel operation. The modification required careful placement of the intake and exhaust shafts, running vertically through the pressure hull, taking up precious space that had once held ammunition or supplies, or simply the breathing room that crews desperately craved. Picture, if you will, the confined darkness of a Type 7's control room as the first retrofitted Schnorchels began their silent work. Additional piping, additional noise sources, additional reminders of the vessel's dependence on this slender mechanical breath. What changed, fundamentally, was the rhythm of patrol itself. Before the Schnorchel's integration, a U-boat's life followed an almost predictable pattern. Surface at dusk when visibility dropped, run the diesel engines to charge the massive battery banks while the crew gulped fresh Atlantic air, then submerge at dawn to hide from hunting aircraft and the growing radar networks that swept the skies above. This cycle was relentless, exhausting, and, by 1943, increasingly deadly. But with the Schnorchel operational, that rhythm fractured. A U-boat could now run its engines while remaining fully submerged, creeping beneath the surface for days at a time, slowing itself to just a few knots to minimize the telltale ripple and vibration that might betray its presence. The patrol pattern became not a series of night runs and day hides, but rather a sustained underwater crawl, interrupted only when fuel or provisions demanded it, or when the crew's nerves simply could not tolerate another hour of submerged confinement. Is it possible to overstate what this meant for survivability? Perhaps not entirely. The statistic that haunts any study of the U-boat war is brutally simple. Between 1943 and 1945, the loss rate for German submarines climbed to devastating proportions. Yet the Schnorchel did extend certain patrols, did allow certain boats to evade certain hunts, did give individual crews something approaching a fighting chance in waters that had become geometrically more hostile. The Type 20 U-boat, Germany's last-ditch technological leap, was designed with the Schnorchel integrated into its very skeleton from the outset. This vessel represented a genuine revolution in submarine design, faster than any Allied hunter that pursued it, capable of remaining submerged for days on end using a revolutionary high-capacity battery, and equipped with a Schnorchel that was no longer an afterthought, but rather an essential organ of its being. Had the war continued, had the Type 21 reached the Atlantic in substantial numbers, had the crews received adequate training to exploit its capabilities, the consequences might have redrawn the map of the final naval campaign. But history is crowded with such conditional phrases, and the reality was far more modest. Only 2 Type 20 Edge actually saw combat, and neither had time to achieve anything of strategic consequence before surrender rendered the entire question moot. Yet for the engineers and designers who built the Type 21, the Schnorchel represented something profound. The acknowledgement that future submarine warfare would not be a dance between surface and deep, but rather a prolonged hiding in the dark, a patient suffocation punctuated by mechanical breath. How did the addition of the Schnorchel actually alter survivability rates across the broader U-boat fleet? The answer sits in a landscape of competing variables, making any definitive claim somewhat elusive. The 1944 statistics show that boats equipped with Schnorchels experienced marginally better survival odds during their individual patrols compared to boats still operating on the older surface and submerge model. But this marginal improvement occurred within a context where the overall survival rate for any U-boat venturing into the Atlantic had become calamitous. For every boat that the Schnorchel preserved, another fell to vastly improved Allied detection systems, to escort vessels equipped with sophisticated sonar, to aircraft carrying sonobuoys and depth charges guided by radar. The Schnorchel bought time, in other words, but could not defeat the fundamental reality. The Allies had won the technological race, and the U-boat war was being decided not by incremental German innovations, but by overwhelming Allied production and tactical coordination. What remains clear, though, is the way the Schnorchel altered the actual experience of submerged patrol. With extended submersion came extended monotony, extended darkness, extended psychological pressure. The crews that manned Schnorchel-equipped U-boats reported a change in the quality of their fear, if such a thing can be measured. Where once the danger had been acute and episodic, the terror of an attacking destroyer escort, the adrenaline of evasion, the relief of safe submergence at dawn, now the danger became chronic and ambient. A crew could spend 72 hours submerged, running on diesel fumes and electrical battery power simultaneously, knowing that the Schnorchel above them was a single mechanical failure away from catastrophic carbon monoxide poisoning. The silence of submerged diesel operation was itself a new kind of torment. The engines, running at reduced power, created a low throb that seemed to resonate through the entire hull, becoming almost meditative in its constancy, yet never quite fading into true background. Men learned to sleep in shifts measured in hours, rather than the night-long reprieve they had known before. They learned to exist in a state of perpetual low-level suffocation, aware always of the air they breathed, of the slight chemical sweetness of diesel exhaust that no amount of ventilation could entirely banish, of the moisture that beaded on every cold steel surface and dripped quietly onto whatever lay beneath. The integration of the Schnorchel into operational practice also forced the U-boat command to reconsider tactical doctrine. A boat moving at 3 or 4 knots while submerged was no longer a predator positioned to strike swift attacks on convoys. Instead, it became a patient stalker, a watcher in the darkness waiting for prey to come near. This required different training, different crew psychology, different expectations about what a patrol might achieve. Some commanding officers adapted to this new reality more successfully than others. Some found the slower, sustained hunt more suited to their temperament and their judgment. Others chafed against it, restless in the enforced stillness, yearning for the old days when a U-boat could race across the surface at 18 knots, running full diesel, the wind in the conning tower, the phosphorescence of disturbed water glowing behind them in the moonlight. That old life had largely vanished by 1944, rendered obsolete by radar, by air patrols, by the sheer density of Allied protection that now surrounded every convoy. The Schnorchel did not restore that life, but it did offer something, a way to live beneath the surface indefinitely, a way to persist in the game, even as the game itself was being lost. The conversion of existing Type 6 to Schnorchel configuration also revealed something of the industrial strain the German war effort was experiencing. The modifications took time, required skilled labor, demanded materials that were increasingly scarce. A U-boat in dry dock for Schnorchel retrofit was a U-boat not on patrol, not hunting, not contributing to whatever strategic purpose remained. The calculus of whether to retrofit older boats or simply build new ones became a constant tension within the Naval High Command. Most boats that received the modification were those already showing damage or wear, boats that were slated for overhaul anyway, boats where the additional expense of retrofit could be justified as part of a broader refresh. By contrast, the Type 21, being new construction, benefited from the Schnorchel as an integral part of its design rather than an addition forced upon it. This distinction, small as it might seem, speaks to larger questions about innovation in wartime. How much can you accomplish by retrofitting old platforms? And when does the effort simply consume resources without changing outcomes? In the case of the Schnorchel and the Type 7, the answer seems to be that it accomplished something, but not enough, and perhaps not in time. But even as the Germans refined their Schnorchel and pushed their boats deeper into the Atlantic's embrace, something else was happening on the surface and in the skies above. The Allies, you see, were watching, they were listening, and they were learning. By the time the Schnorchel began appearing regularly on U-boats in 1944, the British and Americans had already developed a constellation of detection systems that could sense a submarine in ways the Germans had not fully anticipated. Radar sets mounted on escort vessels and patrol aircraft swept the dark water with invisible beams, seeking any metallic protrusion, a periscope, a conning tower, and yes, a Schnorchel mast. The very device designed to keep boats hidden while submerged now became, paradoxically, another target for the hunters above. The Allies understood, perhaps even before the Germans fully grasped it themselves, that this thin tube rising through the waves was a vulnerability wrapped in necessity. And so a quiet technological conversation began to unfold, a kind of underwater chess match where each move by one side prompted a countermove by the other. The British developed what they called Type 271 radar, a centimetric system mounted on destroyers and corvettes that could detect the Schnorchel's modest profile at considerable range, sometimes several miles on a clear night. The Americans, working in parallel, pushed their own radar technology toward ever greater sensitivity. These detection systems were relentless, patient hunters. They did not grow tired. They did not lose focus in the long, dark watches of the North Atlantic. Consider for a moment what this meant for the U-boat captain running submerged on his diesel engines. He could not know, with any certainty, whether his Schnorchel was being tracked at that very instant. The invisible beam might be sweeping across his position. A corvette or a fast patrol boat might be closing on his coordinates, even as he remained committed to his diesel cycles, unable to surface without exposing himself further. There was a peculiar strain in this uncertainty, a kind of sensory deprivation made worse by the knowledge that somewhere above, unseen eyes might be fixed upon him. But the Germans were not passive recipients of this technological onslaught. They responded with their own adaptations and innovations, many of them remarkably clever given the pressures of wartime development. Engineers began experimenting with Schnorchel designs that minimized radar cross-section, reducing the diameter of the mast, coating it with materials that might absorb or scatter radar waves, angling its profile to present a smaller target to the sweeping beams above. Some boats were fitted with rubber or cork coverings, early experiments in what would later become known as radar-absorbing materials. The Schnorchel valve itself became a point of refinement. If the device could be made to extend less height above the waterline, it would present a smaller radar signature. But this brought its own torment. A lower profile meant greater vulnerability to wave action, to sudden surges of water forcing open the valve. Engineers found themselves walking a narrow path between invisibility and function, between staying hidden and staying alive. And then there was the question of sonar. Acoustic detection systems, growing more sophisticated as the war progressed, could sense the acoustic signature of a U-boat's diesel engines even when running submerged on the Schnorchel. The vibrations traveled through the water, a kind of auditory fingerprint that patient listeners could learn to recognize. British and American sonar operators, working in the plotting rooms of escort vessels, became attuned to these distant mechanical sounds. The rhythmic pulse of a diesel engine, the whine of transmission gears, the subtle acoustic disturbances that betrayed a submerged boat trying to charge its batteries while remaining hidden. This created a peculiar form of acoustic warfare. The U-boats, knowing their engines could be heard, sometimes attempted to mask these sounds by operating at reduced power, by synchronizing engine cycles with the rhythm of the sea itself, hoping to blend their mechanical voice with the ambient noise of the ocean. Some boats experimented with rubber mountings and vibration dampeners, trying to reduce the acoustic energy transmitted into the water. It was a fascinating arms race, conducted in frequencies below human hearing, in vibrations that might mean the difference between surfacing another day and plunging toward the deep. The Allies, in turn, developed increasingly sophisticated listening devices. Hydrophone arrays grew more sensitive. Radio direction finding systems could sometimes detect the faint transmissions of a U-boat trying to maintain contact with headquarters, even when the boat itself remained submerged. The German Navy discovered, to their mounting horror, that their Schnorchel solution, which had seemed so elegant, so promising, did not actually solve the fundamental problem of being hunted. It only postponed it, and in doing so, created new vulnerabilities they had not entirely foreseen. By late 1944, the technological duel had become remarkably sophisticated. The Germans would introduce a new radar countermeasure, perhaps a shifted frequency, perhaps a different coating material, and within weeks, or sometimes days, the Allies would develop a detection method that rendered it obsolete. It was exhausting for both sides, this endless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. Resources were poured into laboratories and design bureaus. Scientists and engineers worked under enormous pressure, knowing that their calculations and designs might translate directly into human lives at sea. There was something almost peaceful about this duel in retrospect. A kind of intellectual conversation conducted across the ocean, beneath the waves, without the roar of gunfire and explosions. Yet it was no less deadly. Each refinement, each countermeasure, each clever adaptation brought the submarines and their hunters into closer, more dangerous proximity. The war at sea, in the depths where the Schnorchel operated, became an increasingly intimate battle between human ingenuity and the ocean's merciless indifference to all ambitious technologies. The boats that sailed with these refined schnorkels were themselves evolving as well, becoming faster, deeper diving, more resilient to the pressures around them. What did it feel like, those first hours when the valve was opened and the diesel engine began to breathe again, while the submarine remained hidden beneath the waves? The men who operated the U-1206, the U-995, the U-2519, and dozens of others who crewed these vessels during the final phases of the war left us few intimate records. Most did not survive to write memoirs, and those who did often struggled to articulate the peculiar exhaustion of operating in this new way. Yet from the fragmentary accounts that have surfaced, and from the technical logs and debriefings that followed the war, we can reconstruct something of the texture of those long, submerged transits. The ritual of engaging the Schnorchel began with a careful process. A young engineer would move through the submarine's control room, and in the larger Type 7 boats, this space was never wider than perhaps 10 feet, never taller than 6, with pipes and valves and gauges crowding every surface, and would begin checking the systems that no previous generation of U-boat crews had ever needed to monitor continuously. The mast had to be raised carefully, slowly, to break the surface without creating the telltale wake that would alert a listening destroyer far above. And then came the moment of opening the valve itself. One can imagine the breath held in common, the way sound travels differently through a steel hull when the engines are drawing air from outside rather than from the recycled, tired atmosphere within. The air that came down through the Schnorchel was strange to the men who breathed it. It carried with it the salt taste of the Atlantic, the mineral coldness of the open ocean, but also, and here the testimony becomes quieter, more uncertain, something that seemed to the submarine's crew like a return to normalcy, that was, paradoxically, the most unnatural thing they had experienced. The diesel engines roared to life, with a sound that traveled through the entire vessel like a heartbeat, vibrating through the bunks and the metal walkways and the spine of every man aboard. For the first time in hours, perhaps, the batteries were charging. The submarine was not slowly dying anymore. It was alive again, feeding on the world above while remaining hidden. And yet the Schnorchel brought with it its own peculiar terrors. The float valve, that clever device meant to seal itself instantly if water threatened to enter the tube, was prone to sticking. The wave motion was unpredictable. One moment the men would feel a gentle vibration, the normal oscillation of the diesel at work, and the next moment there would be a sudden jarring, a violent intake of breath by the engine, and seawater would spray down into the submarine like a sudden rupture of the barrier between the world above and the world below. When this happened, the effect was not merely mechanical, it was psychological. Consider the experience of the men in the engine room during such a moment. They were already existing in a state of heightened awareness, cooped in a space no larger than a long hallway, surrounded by machinery that demanded absolute attention. The smell in an operating U-boat using the Schnorchel was distinctly different from what earlier crews had known. There was still the omnipresent diesel fume, that acrid, heavy odor that some men grew to associate with life itself, since the engines meant air, meant movement, meant hope, but now it was joined by something more troubling. Carbon monoxide accumulated differently in a submerged hull, where the Schnorchel created a seal that was never quite perfect. the air grew stale more quickly, even as fresh oxygen was technically being drawn from above. Some accounts describe a peculiar sensation of suffocation, even while breathing, a heaviness in the chest that no amount of ventilation could quite dispel. The sound, too, was an ever-present companion to this new way of operating. The schnorchel itself, though it was a relatively simple tube, created a distinctive whistle when water rushed across its opening at certain angles. The men came to recognize this whistle the way a sailor might recognize the call of a particular gull. It was familiar, yet it always carried an edge of warning. When the whistle changed pitch, when it became irregular or stopped entirely, the crew's attention would sharpen. It might mean nothing. It might mean that a wave had temporarily blocked the inlet, or it might mean that something above them, something large and predatory, was drawing near. The visual monotony of a long submerged transit cannot be overstated in its psychological weight. The men of a U-boat could move from compartment to compartment, forward torpedo room, control room, wireless room, engine room, but each space was essentially identical in its character. They were sealed tubes. The lights were always on, a dim amber glow from incandescent bulbs that had been hoarded like precious resources, creating pools of visibility surrounded by deep shadow. There were no windows. There had never been windows. But before the schnorchel, there had at least been the knowledge that surfacing would come relatively soon, perhaps in an hour, perhaps in 2, when the batteries had charged enough to justify the risk. With the schnorchel, the submersion became indefinite. A U-boat could, in theory, remain submerged for days using the new system, allowing the crew to move through the ocean while the hunters above hunted blind. The men who experienced this reported a strange inversion of their expectations. Instead of relief, many felt a mounting anxiety. The knowledge that you could stay down forever, or nearly forever, somehow made the darkness press harder against your shoulders. One U-boat officer, in a post-war interview that remained obscure for decades, described something of this sensation. He spoke of lying in his bunk, and the bunks in a submerged U-boat were coffin-like, stacked 3 high in some cases, with barely enough space to turn over, and listening to the sound of the diesel echoing through the steel hull above and around him. It was hypnotic, yes, but it was also maddening. The steady thump of the engine became indistinguishable from the pulse of blood in his ears. Men would sleep, but their sleep was not restful. They would wake disoriented, unable for a moment to remember whether they had been dreaming of being on the surface or of sinking deeper into the ocean. The routine of a schnorchel watch became a ritual within the routine. Every hour, someone had to check the float valve assembly, examining the complex little mechanism that stood between the submarine and catastrophic flooding. The responsibility was immense, though it never appeared so in any official manual. The men who held this watch, often young sailors, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, chosen because of their steady hands and their ability to maintain focus in the submarine's artificial environment, developed a kind of meditative attention. They would run their fingers over the valve assembly, feeling for any irregularity in the way it sat in its housing. They would listen to the sound of water rushing past the mast above, learning to distinguish between the gentle murmur of normal wave action and the hiss of spray hitting the antenna array. What must have gone through the minds of these young men? The historical record is largely silent on this question, but we can make educated guesses. Each one of them knew, at some level, that the schnorchel was a technology born of desperation. The Allies' air superiority had forced the German Navy into a corner. Surfacing meant vulnerability, meant probable detection by radar and aircraft, but staying down without the schnorchel meant a battery that would eventually be exhausted, a submarine that would have to surface anyway, and with less charge left in reserve, with less time to dive again if danger appeared. The schnorchel was not a solution. It was a way of managing a series of unacceptable choices. The passage of time underwater seemed to move differently for the crews. Some described it as slowed, as if the heavy pressure of the ocean outside somehow compressed the moments themselves. Others spoke of it as distorted, fragmented. They would lose track of whether it had been 2 hours or 4 since the watch changed, whether they had slept or merely rested in a state between waking and dreaming. The smell of the boat, which we have mentioned before, accumulated in ways that made it difficult to maintain perspective. By the second day of continuous Schnorchel operation, the air inside the U-boat became thick with the odors of humanity and machinery in close quarters. The men's sweat, their breath, the fumes from the diesel engines, the oil that they worked with, the food that was prepared in tiny galleys by cooks who had to work in spaces barely large enough to move in, all of it mingled and intensified in the sealed environment. What small comforts did they allow themselves? The historical accounts suggest that men found solace in the small rituals that structure time and provide continuity. There was an almost ceremonial quality to the meals, sparse as they were. There was music, when the radio operators could receive it through the Schnorchel's communication equipment. There were letters that men would sometimes write to wives or mothers, letters that they knew would likely never be sent, and perhaps that was part of the point. To pretend, to maintain the fiction of a future in which they would surface and return home. There were also the small competitions and games that men invented to pass the time. Card games played in whispers, stories told and retold in the confined space of a bunk room, jokes that had been told so many times they had achieved a kind of sacred status, their humor almost irrelevant compared to their function as anchors to normalcy. The technical challenges of the Schnorchel created their own peculiar stresses. A blockage in the air intake, caused perhaps by ice or by the detritus of the ocean, would create a sudden reduction in air pressure that would affect the entire boat. Men who had not been thinking about breathing would suddenly become acutely aware of each breath, aware of the effort required, aware of the fragility of the system that kept them alive. When the engineers managed to clear the blockage, and they always did, there was a visible relaxation that moved through the submarine like a wave of warmth, though the physical conditions had not actually changed. There is a curious paradox in the accounts that have survived. The men of the U-boats seemed, in the long accounts they gave after the war, to speak of the Schnorchel with a kind of perverse affection. It had enabled their survival in a war that was increasingly unwinnable. It had allowed them to continue their patrols in the face of overwhelming odds. It had been a lifeline, in the most literal sense. And yet there is also, running beneath these accounts, a thread of something else, a kind of numbness, perhaps, or a recognition that even the Schnorchel, for all its ingenuity, had not ultimately, and yet, for all its promise, the Schnorchel was far from a perfect solution to the U-boat's predicament. It was, in many ways, a compromise, elegant in concept, but burdened by a series of practical limitations that would haunt every commander and engineer who relied upon it. Consider what happened when a submarine attempted to run its diesel engines while remaining submerged using this new apparatus. The engines themselves, powerful machines designed to move tons of steel through water, demanded enormous quantities of air. At full operational speed, a Type Phi U-boat's diesel plant required more oxygen per minute than the Schnorchel could reliably deliver from that single thin pipe threading up through the darkness toward the surface far above. This created a peculiar and exhausting constraint. When operating under Schnorchel, a U-boat could barely maintain 7 or 8 knots, a crawling pace compared to the 12 or 13 knots it could achieve if it dared to surface. For a submarine hunted continuously by aircraft and escort vessels equipped with ever-sharper radar, this reduction in speed was profoundly limiting. A slow-moving target in the vast Atlantic was still a target, still trackable, still vulnerable. To catch a convoy, to position for an attack, to flee from danger, All of these maneuvers demanded speed that the Schnorchel fundamentally denied them. The diesel engines themselves, meanwhile, suffered under the strain of this restricted air supply. An internal combustion engine breathing partially through a valve-controlled snorkel rather than freely through open air enters a state of stress. Fuel combustion becomes incomplete. Pressure fluctuations ripple through the cylinders. Metal components, pistons, rings, exhaust manifolds, wear more rapidly under these uneven conditions. Engines designed in peacetime to operate with predictable air intake now found themselves gasping, catching, then suddenly gulping when wave action allowed momentary surges of air down the tube. Engineers in the U-boat's cramped machinery spaces began to notice that their engines ran rough, hotter, angrier. The rhythmic thump of diesel combustion took on a strained quality that seasoned sailors could hear through the steel hull itself. But the most insidious and unpredictable threat came not from the engine's mechanical stress, but from the Schnorchel's single most vulnerable point, the float valve at its head. This ingenious device, designed to close when waves washed over it and seal the intake against water ingress, was elegant in principle. In practice, it became a source of constant anxiety. Picture it, a thin metal tube extending above the ocean's surface in heavy Atlantic swells. Waves build. The tube dips into the crest of a swell. The float within the valve head rises as water pressure increases, shutting the intake chamber closed. The engines below suddenly find their air supply cut off. What happens next occurs in milliseconds, but to a submariner, it feels like forever. When air supply to a diesel engine stops abruptly, vacuum forms in the cylinders. The engine gasps, lurches, sometimes stalls, but before it can stall completely, atmospheric pressure inside the boat, still maintained by other ventilation systems, forces the engine to draw that internal air, creating enormous negative pressure throughout the submarine's interior spaces. The sensation is visceral. Ears pop, pressure builds in the sinuses and chest. Crew members describe a sudden, dizzying vacuum that makes breathing difficult, and this was not a rare occurrence. In rough seas, especially those common in the North Atlantic in autumn and winter, the Schnorchel valve would close dozens of times per hour. The flooding risk, however, proved even more troubling than these pressure shocks. The valve mechanism, for all its clever engineering, was not perfect. It could become stuck. Salt corrosion accumulated on moving parts. Barnacles and marine organisms sometimes fouled the chamber. An improperly closed valve during rough weather meant water began trickling, then flowing, into the air intake shaft. The intake manifold filled. Water crept toward the diesel engines themselves. In those compressed moments, when a crew member realized water was entering the engine compartment, the response had to be instantaneous. Valves were thrown, Schnorchel operations were abandoned. The boat shifted to battery power and dove deeper, away from the surface where no fresh air could be drawn. The engines fell silent. For a submarine captain, this represented a kind of torment. He had adopted the Schnorchel specifically to remain submerged and hidden, but the very device meant to enable this hiding often forced him back into battery operation, the thing he was trying to avoid. Battery power, limited and finite, could not sustain high speeds or maneuvers for long. Every unscheduled closure of that valve, every flooding incident that necessitated a return to battery dependence, meant lost hours of diesel-powered endurance. It meant reduced range, reduced options, reduced hope of reaching distant hunting grounds or returning safely to port. There was a peculiar cruelty in this limitation that went beyond mere engineering inconvenience. The Schnorchel had promised to transform the submarine into a creature of permanent submersion, free from the lethal exposure of surface running, but it delivered only a partial metamorphosis. The boat could hide better than before, true, The crew could remain submerged longer, breathing recycled air and diesel fumes in darkness. Yet they remained slow, vulnerable in different ways. The Schnorchel had not solved the U-boat's fundamental problem, that it was trapped in a contest with faster, more powerful surface and air forces. It had merely shifted the nature of that trap. Consider the cumulative effect over weeks or months at sea. A commander running under Schnorchel in enemy waters cannot push hard without risking mechanical catastrophe, cannot afford extensive valve closures when fuel is already limited, cannot risk the slow burn of battery power when diesel should still be available. The entire enterprise becomes one of cautious management, a kind of underwater chess in which each position must be carefully considered, each movement measured against unseen costs. The engineering challenges were real, but they created too a psychological burden that modern observers sometimes overlook. A crew was not simply operating a submarine with certain technical limitations. They were living inside a compromise, day after day, in profound darkness and isolation. While the Schnorchel gave German submariners the gift of silent travel beneath the waves, the world above the water was undergoing its own revolution, a quiet transformation in how navies would hunt and see in darkness. And it is here that our story branches into something far larger than one ingenious German tube, into a technological awakening that would reshape naval warfare itself. Consider for a moment what it meant to hunt an invisible target in an ocean that stretches across continents. Before the early 1940s, both the Allies and the Axis relied on something almost primitive by later standards: the human ear. A listening device called a hydrophone, not so different from a stethoscope held to the ocean's chest, could detect the rhythmic throb of distant propellers through water. But the ocean is vast and noisy. Whales cry out in the deep. Ships creak and groan. Waves generate their own whispered conversations with the depths below. How does one listen for a single heartbeat in a chorus of 10,000? Then came sonar. The word itself is an American invention, sound navigation and ranging, though the British had been developing similar technology under the name ASDIC since the 1930s. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than merely listening, why not speak into the darkness and listen for the echo? Send a pulse of sound through the water. Wait. When that pulse strikes a solid object, a submarine's hull, a metal mine, the rocky slope of a continental shelf, it bounces back. The returning echo tells you distance, direction, sometimes even the nature of what you have struck. The first true sonar sets were crude instruments. They required a trained operator, a man sitting in a dim compartment with headphones clamped to his ears, listening for the subtle shift in pitch and intensity that might indicate a U-boat somewhere below. The technology was far from certain. False echoes bounced from thermal layers in the water, invisible boundaries where warm ocean met cold, creating acoustic mirages. Schools of fish sometimes returned echoes strong enough to mislead an entire hunting vessel. There was something almost unbearably lonely about this work, this vigilant listening in semi-darkness, knowing that your ears and the machine's sensitivity might mean the difference between your ship surviving the night or sinking into the abyss. But the Allies were learning. Slowly, incrementally, sonar sets improved. By the middle of the war, escort vessels equipped with sonar could detect a submerged U-boat at distances of several hundred yards, enough distance to plan an attack, to coordinate with other ships, to close in before the submarine knew it had been found. The acoustic advantage had shifted. A submarine captain could no longer assume invisibility simply by pushing down beneath the waves. Something new was hunting in the darkness alongside him, something that listened more intently than he did. Above the waves, an equally profound revolution was unfolding. Radar, radio detection and ranging, had emerged from British scientific laboratories as one of the true marvels of the war. Here was a technology that could see through darkness and cloud and rain, that could paint a picture of a ship's position on a glowing screen from miles away. Early radar sets were mounted on naval vessels and gradually on aircraft as well. They sent out pulses of radio waves into the night, and those pulses traveled until they struck metal, then bounced back to the receiver. The operator saw not a direct image but a ghostly blip, a brightening of light on a circular screen that told him distance and bearing. For the U-boat war, radar represented a particular nightmare. A surfaced U-boat, even running at night to recharge its batteries and refresh its air, could now be detected by an escorting aircraft from distances it could not even see. The night, once the submarine's greatest ally, had become transparent. Aircraft equipped with radar could hunt in darkness as effectively as they hunted in daylight. The Schnorchel, in this context, becomes something more than mere engineering. It becomes a response to this technological encroachment, a way to avoid the necessity of surfacing altogether. But the Germans were not passive observers of these innovations. They too were developing radar. They understood its principles and recognized its threat. By the middle of the war, German submarines were equipped with METOX radar detectors, passive devices that could sense the pulse of enemy radar before the submarine was actually spotted by it. A U-boat captain with a vigilant radioman could sometimes hear the characteristic chirp of a searching radar set and know that danger was near, could dive deep or alter course before the aircraft or escort vessel even knew he was there. It was a kind of conversation conducted across technological channels, each side trying to hide while listening for the other's voice. There developed, in other words, an escalating dance of innovation. The Allies improved their sonar, and the Germans learned to make their U-boats quieter, to reduce the acoustic signature that betrayed their location. The Allies developed radar, and the Germans built radar detectors. The Allies learned to counter radar detection with new radar frequencies that the old detectors could not perceive. Back and forth, action and response, each innovation spawning a counter-innovation, creating layers of technological complexity that wrapped themselves around the simple act of hunting and hiding in the ocean. What strikes one, in contemplating this peculiar arms race, is how much of it remained invisible to the men themselves who participated in it. A U-boat captain rarely saw a sonar operator thousands of miles away, listening for the sound of his engines. A radar operator on a British escort vessel never encountered the engineer who had designed the METOX detector that was even now scanning for his radar pulse. Yet they were deeply connected, engaged in a kind of intimate technological struggle, each trying to outthink the other through layers of water and air and electromagnetic spectrum. There was also something almost musical about the way these systems evolved in parallel. Just as the Schnorchel represented a gradual German response to the tactical problem of forced surface running, so too did sonar and radar represent a gradual Allied response to the problem of submarine invisibility. Neither side could have predicted, in the early years of the war, that by 1943 and 1944, the fundamental nature of underwater warfare would be so thoroughly transformed by passive listening devices and electromagnetic pulses. Innovation breeds innovation, and in this hidden war beneath the surface, the technology spiraled forward almost of its own momentum. Consider also what these parallel developments meant for the men living within the steel hulls. A U-boat crew running on Schnorchel power now existed not only in the darkness of the ocean, but in the darkness of technological uncertainty. They knew they were being hunted by forces they could not see. They knew that sound itself had become a weapon against them. A careless noise, a wrench dropped on a metal deck, a man coughing in the wrong moment, the momentary increase in engine vibration as the diesel engine struggled under submerged conditions. Any of these might be picked up by a sonar set miles away and translated into targeting information. The war had become quieter and more intimate, and somehow more terrifying, precisely because of these sensing devices that had made the ocean transparent in new ways. The Schnorchel, then, was not merely a German innovation operating in isolation. It was part of a vast, interlocking system of technologies, all trying to answer fundamental questions about visibility and invisibility, about how to see and how to hide in a medium, the ocean, that seemed both to promise concealment and to reveal everything. The submarine war became not just a physical contest, but a technological and psychological one, played out in listening stations and radar compartments, and in the cramped, darkened interiors of submarines, where crews waited and listened for the sounds that would tell them if they had been found. By the autumn of 1943, as the first operational Schnorchels slipped into service aboard the larger U-boat fleets, the mathematics of submarine warfare had begun to shift in ways that neither the Allies nor the Germans fully grasped at first. The technology arrived not as a triumph, but as a reprieve, a narrow window of extended underwater endurance that would, quite unexpectedly, breathe new life into a battle already tilting heavily against Dönitz's once formidable underwater armada. Picture, if you will, the captain's perspective in those closing months of 1943 and into 1944. A U-boat equipped with this new breathing tube no longer faced the binary choice between surfacing to recharge and running blind on battery reserves. The hours of vulnerability, that terrible, skin-prickling exposure when a periscope broke the surface and radar-equipped aircraft hunted the horizon, could now be compressed. A Schnorchel-fitted boat could run its diesel engines while remaining submerged, creeping forward at a sustainable pace, drawing fresh air through that thin metallic stalk while exhaust bubbled away beneath the waves. For crews who had grown accustomed to the suffocating intimacy of a submerged tube, waiting in acoustic silence for the telltale throb of an approaching destroyer, the Schnorchel offered something more valuable than speed or firepower. It offered time. The Atlantic convoy routes of 1944 became, in some sense, a proving ground for this technology, not a successful one by most historical measures, but significant nonetheless, in demonstrating that the U-boat arm need not entirely vanish from the ocean's surface. Did the Schnorchel reverse the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic? The records whisper a complicated answer. What it did accomplish was measurable. If modest, it extended operational endurance by days, reduced the frequency of sightings by Allied patrol aircraft by allowing boats to transit deeper while moving, and most importantly, it provided a psychological anchor to crews who had watched their comrades disappear into the depths at an accelerating rate. A U-boat with a Schnorchel was not invulnerable. The technology carried its own liabilities, as we have touched upon before, but it was less mortal, less immediately visible, less easy to dismiss as a floating coffin. The final year and a half of the war saw scattered increases in U-boat sorties from German ports, not because new submarines were being built in significant numbers. The shipyards themselves were under constant bombardment, but because the ones that remained could operate longer, range farther, and present a persistent if attenuated threat to Allied shipping. The Schnorchel could not restore naval superiority. It could not repel radar-equipped liberators or crack the growing sophistication of Allied sonar networks. What it could do, and did do, was stretch the war's end into an agonizing series of extended engagements rather than a swift capitulation. In a war already decided by 1943, this extension mattered less to strategists in Berlin than to the men breathing manufactured air and swallowing diesel fumes in the cramped darkness of their steel hulls. As the war itself began to dissolve in 1945, as German submarines made their final patrols and Atlantic convoys began to thin, something unexpected occurred in the minds of naval architects elsewhere. The Allies, when they seized U-boat pens at Wilhelmshaven and Hamburg and began cataloguing the fleet they had inherited, could see with their own eyes what the Schnorchel represented. It was not magic, nor was it revolutionary in any single aspect of its engineering. It was, instead, a methodical solution to a persistent problem: how to conduct underwater warfare without rising to the surface like a creature gasping for breath. The British, the Americans, and eventually the Soviets, who obtained captured U-boats and German technical drawings as spoils of war, all recognized that this innovation, however modest, pointed toward the future of submarine design. They saw in the Schnorchel a prophetic glimpse of the submarine of tomorrow, one that could operate indefinitely beneath the waves, without the crippling necessity of surfacing to recharge batteries or flush out the poisoned air of human respiration and diesel combustion. The post-war years witnessed a curious convergence of interest. Former enemy nations found themselves studying German submarine technology with the same intensity that their scientists were studying rocket designs and aircraft blueprints. The Schnorchel, in its elegant simplicity, became one of the most immediately transferable pieces of German naval engineering. It required no arcane theoretical knowledge to understand how to improve upon it. It demanded no leaps of intuition to see how it could be refined, strengthened, made more reliable, integrated into new hull designs. The British, in particular, began retrofitting their own submarines with snorkel apparatus derived from captured German examples. The Dutch, who had pioneered these concepts before the war and watched their own naval designs disappear into German war industries, returned to research they had abandoned years earlier. French naval engineers examined the technology. American naval planners, watching the Soviet Union consolidate control over Eastern Europe and begin a massive submarine construction program, understood with crystalline clarity that the underwater realm would be where the next great power struggle unfolded. The Schnorchel's true significance in the post-war era lay not in its technical sophistication — modern diesel-electric submarines would eventually surpass it — but in what it represented philosophically. It demonstrated that a submarine need not surface to survive, that extended underwater operations were not merely theoretical, but practically achievable with the right engineering. This realization cascaded through the post-war submarine programs of every major naval power. The French built their naval-class boats with snorkels. The British developed increasingly sophisticated versions for their conventional submarines. The Dutch, naturally, returned to their own pre-war innovations and developed them further. Even Japan, their defeat absolute and their naval industry dismantled, could observe in technical journals and captured documents how the technology had evolved. By the 1950s, the snorkel had become so ubiquitous in conventional submarine design that it was less a feature to be highlighted and more a standard expectation of any modern undersea craft not powered by nuclear propulsion. The Soviet Navy, in particular, found in Schnorchel technology a crucial stepping stone toward their own ambitious underwater expansion. With access to German U-boats and technical intelligence gathered during the post-war occupation of Germany, Soviet engineers rapidly absorbed and improved upon the design. The Whiskey-class submarines that emerged in the early 1950s, considered one of the first truly modern Soviet undersea vessels, incorporated snorkel capabilities that owed a clear lineage to those thin metal tubes that had churned through the Atlantic darkness less than a decade earlier. Why did this technology matter so profoundly to Soviet planners? Because it represented a path towards submarine sophistication that did not require the enormous industrial investment of nuclear power. A snorkeling diesel-electric boat could operate for extended periods beneath the surface, could transit ocean basins, could remain on patrol while remaining largely invisible. In the emerging Cold War, where missile-carrying submarines would eventually become the ultimate expression of strategic deterrence, the Schnorchel represented a transitional technology, not the final answer, but a crucial bridge between the submarine war of the past and the oceanic strategy of the future. The influence flowed outward in concentric circles. British and French submarines of the 1950s and 1960s, many built with snorkels derived ultimately from German designs, became the workhorses of NATO's undersea operations during the height of Cold War tensions. Swedish submarines, Swiss submarines, even the navies of smaller nations that required submarine capability on limited budgets, incorporated snorkel technology because it offered a practical solution to a fundamental problem. One might pause and wonder, how many of the submarines that carried nuclear weapons, that patrolled beneath the Arctic ice, that became the invisible guardians of national deterrent strategies, owed some debt to that innovation born from German desperation in 1943? The answer is subtle and layered. The nuclear submarines that eventually dominated Cold War strategy operated on fundamentally different principles. They did not need to surface at all, ever, their reactors providing both propulsion and the power to regenerate breathable air indefinitely. Yet the earlier generations of boats that led the way toward nuclear power, that trained the crews and established the doctrines and developed the tactics of submarine warfare, many of these operated with snorkels. The technology existed in a transitional moment, serving as a practical solution for an intermediate era of submarine warfare. In the technical literature of post-war submarine engineering, one encounters Schnorchel variations, refinements, and improvements accumulated across multiple nations and decades. Engineers in different countries, working independently and from different starting points, all arrived at similar conclusions about how to make the technology more reliable, more automatic, more resistant to the hazards of wave action and engine strain. The basic principle remained unchanged. A tube running from the submarine to near the surface, air drawn down to feed diesel engines, exhaust pushed back upward, but the details proliferated. Valve mechanisms became more sophisticated. Float systems grew more responsive. Material tolerances tightened. Air filtration improved. Carbon monoxide scrubbing became more effective. By the 1960s and 1970s, snorkel systems aboard the submarines of Western navies had evolved far beyond the desperate expedients of wartime U-boats. Yet at their heart, they remained recognizably descended from those original German designs, which themselves had been inspired by Dutch peacetime experiments conducted more than a decade before the war began. There is something almost poignant in tracing this genealogy of technology. An innovation born from the desire to extend submarine endurance in a losing war became, in peace, a fundamental feature of undersea vessels designed to navigate an entirely different kind of conflict, one measured in patrols of endless duration and in the permanent readiness for a war that mercifully never came. The Schnorchel's role in prolonging the U-boat war's final year should not be overstated. It did not, as some post-war German accounts suggested, promise a resurgence of submarine dominance. The Allies' radar networks and aircraft had grown too sophisticated, too numerous, too effective. The convoy system too well organized, the anti-submarine warfare doctrine too refined. By the time Schnorkels became operationally widespread in 1944, the fundamental outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic had already been determined. German U-boats would continue to hunt and sometimes to sink merchant vessels, would continue to require constant counter-operations by the Allies, but the age when they threatened the convoy system's viability had passed. What the Schnorchel did accomplish was more subtle. It maintained a threat. It extended the war's oceanic dimension. It kept submarine crews at sea and in danger, even as the broader military situation collapsed. As the war drew to its close, and the Allied navies began to understand what they had learned from the Schnorchel's presence in their midst, military architects across the world were already asking themselves a question that would reshape submarine design for generations to come. What if this small innovation could be refined, perfected, made reliable enough to become the foundation of an entirely new class of undersea vessels? The answer lay not in the defeated German shipyards, but in the careful hands of victorious nations who had captured intact Schnorchel-equipped U-boats and were now studying them with the intensity of engineers who had glimpsed the future. The Soviet Union, in particular, recognized immediately what the Schnorchel represented. Here was a technology that allowed a submarine to remain beneath the surface while still operating its diesel engines, which meant longer endurance, greater stealth, and the possibility of conducting patrols that could stretch for weeks without the risk of being spotted on the surface. They began integrating Schnorchel systems into their early post-war submarine designs, the Whiskey-class boats that emerged in the late 1940s, carrying refinements on the German original. The Schnorchel was no longer a desperate measure born from Allied pressure. It was becoming an expectation, a standard feature of modern submarine architecture. Think of it this way: once humanity glimpses a possibility, even one born from wartime desperation, it rarely relinquishes the dream of making it better. The Americans approached the problem with their characteristic pragmatism and engineering thoroughness. They had studied captured Schnorchels, tested them in their own vessels, and recognized both their potential and their profound limitations. Traditional diesel-electric submarines, which had served them so well in the Pacific War, still relied fundamentally on surfacing to recharge their batteries and refresh the air. The Schnorchel extended underwater endurance, yes, but it did not eliminate the core vulnerability. A submarine still needed to expose that thin pipe above the waves, still needed to operate at relatively shallow depths to do so effectively, and still faced the constant threat of the pipe being spotted by watchful eyes. What the Americans needed was not merely the Schnorchel, but something more radical, a way to power submarines underwater without relying on diesel engines at all, or at least without needing to surface to use them. This tension between what the Schnorchel made possible and what remained impossible drove submarine engineers toward a path that would take decades to fully develop. In the immediate post-war years, the focus remained on incremental refinement. The Schnorchel that entered service on early Soviet and Chinese submarines was mechanically more robust than the German wartime versions, with better valve designs and improved exhaust routing. The French experimented with Schnorchel-equipped boats in the 1950s. The British incorporated variations into their later diesel-electric designs. Each navy learned from the experiences of wartime crews, from the engineering reports captured in German archives, and from their own trials and errors. The valve mechanisms became more reliable. The air intake and exhaust pathways were redesigned to minimize the risk of water ingress. Materials science improved, allowing for better sealing and longer operational lifespans. Yet the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Schnorchel was elegant in its simplicity, but that simplicity carried with it certain immutable constraints. By the 1960s, as the Cold War deepened and both superpowers raced to build ever more capable submarine fleets, a different transformation began to take shape. Nuclear propulsion had arrived, offering the submarine world something the Schnorchel could never provide: true underwater endurance, the ability to remain submerged indefinitely, with virtually unlimited range and speed. The American Nautilus and her successors changed the calculus entirely. Yet even as nuclear submarines came to dominate strategic thinking and force projection, the diesel-electric submarine did not disappear. It remained cheaper to build, quieter in certain operational regimes, and suited to many of the world's navies who could neither afford nor, in some cases, were permitted by treaty to operate nuclear vessels. For these submarines, the Schnorchel remained relevant, but it was also becoming evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The real innovation that would eventually supersede the Schnorchel came from a different direction entirely. Consider the basic paradox that the Schnorchel had never truly solved. You needed air to run a diesel engine, and to get air, you needed to be shallow enough for a pipe to reach the surface. What if instead you carried your own source of oxygen? What if the engine itself could be powered by a system that required no external air intake at all? This was the fundamental thinking that led to the development of air-independent propulsion, or AIP systems, which began emerging in prototype form in the 1980s and became increasingly practical through the 1990s and beyond. The Swedish Gotland-class submarines, the German Type 212, the Spanish S-80 class, these represented a lineage of thinking that stretched directly back to the engineers who had first asked themselves how to keep a diesel engine running while staying underwater. AIP systems work through a principle of stored chemical or physical energy. Some use fuel cells, others employ closed-cycle diesel engines that carry their own oxidant, still others use liquid oxygen or other chemical propellants. What they share in common is this: they allow a diesel-electric submarine to remain submerged for days or even weeks, operating at moderate speeds, without ever needing to expose a Schnorchel pipe to the surface. In essence, AIP represents the logical endpoint of a line of thinking that began with a simple tube and a float valve during the darkest days of the German U-boat war. The Schnorchel asked the question, how can we stay under longer? AIP perfected the answer: eliminate the need for external air entirely. Yet the technology itself, the actual physical Schnorchel pipe and its associated systems, did not vanish from modern submarine design. Instead, it persisted in a somewhat different role. Many contemporary diesel-electric submarines, even those equipped with AIP systems, retain Schnorchel-like induction masts, now often called snorkels, not because they are necessary for normal operations, but because they offer a fallback option, a way to use the diesel engines in an emergency or in specific tactical situations where the added speed or power is worth the momentary risk of exposure. On the French Agosta-class submarines, on the Italian Sauro-class boats, on the Russian Kilo-class vessels that have become the workhorses of many smaller navies, the Schnorchel endures, often now made of composite materials instead of steel, featuring sophisticated valve mechanisms that use positive pressure and sophisticated engineering to prevent any water whatsoever from entering the submarine. It has become simultaneously obsolete and essential, a relic of wartime desperation that has transformed into a standard safety system and emergency capability. The journey from that first improvised Schnorchel installed on U-boats in 1943 and 1944 to the sophisticated AIP systems of the 21st century spans 3/4 of a century and multiple technological revolutions. Yet if you trace the conceptual thread, the idea of extending underwater endurance through clever management of propulsion and air, you can see an unbroken line of engineering thinking. Each generation of designers looked at what their predecessors had accomplished and asked themselves, how can we do this better? How can we eliminate the vulnerability? How can we make the underwater boat truly underwater, no longer dependent on a thin pipe above the surface to breathe? The Schnorchel was the first major step in that journey, born not from careful peacetime research, but from the desperate circumstances of submarines being hunted to the brink of extinction. And though the technology itself has evolved almost beyond recognition, though contemporary submarines operate according to principles their wartime predecessors could scarcely have imagined, the fundamental insight remains. In the silent depths, the ability to stay hidden and continue moving is everything. What begins as a thin tube of desperation becomes, in the end, something far more profound, a mirror held up to human consciousness itself. The Schnorchel was never truly an invention born in a moment of bright clarity in some engineer's laboratory. It emerged instead from the dark marriage of necessity and fear, from the peculiar pressure that war exerts on the mind when survival depends on finding what does not yet exist. In those years when Allied aircraft ruled the surface and U-boat commanders watched their fleets diminish with each passing month, the Schnorchel represented something almost transcendent, not merely a mechanical solution, but an act of refusal, a refusal to accept the ocean as an enemy, when the real enemy circled above. Consider the remarkable fact that the device itself was deceptively simple. A valve, a float, an intake shaft, an exhaust routing, all of it crude by later standards, all of it subject to malfunction, to water ingress, to the thousand small catastrophes that come when you ask metal and rubber to hold back the sea. And yet in its simplicity lay its genius. The Schnorchel did not promise perfection. It promised only that a man might breathe, that an engine might turn, that one more hour beneath the surface might be purchased at the cost of carbon monoxide and claustrophobia and the grinding psychological weight of submersion. What kind of calculation drives an engineer to accept such terms? What part of human nature allows us to say, with full knowledge of the cost, that even this is preferable to the alternative? The men who refined the Schnorchel between 1943 and 1945 were working within a frame of reference that few of us today can truly inhabit. They lived in a world where the surface of the ocean had become enemy territory, where daylight itself posed mortal danger. Their submarines were no longer vessels of exploration or tactical advantage. They had become coffins with engines, and the only difference between a coffin that remained sealed and one that became a grave was the narrowest possible margin. In such a world, you do not dream of comfort or efficiency. You dream only of extending the interval, of creating the smallest possible gap through which life might continue. The Schnorchel was that gap made manifest. What is perhaps most striking, when you consider the full arc of the Schnorchel's history, is that it arrived at a moment when the outcome was already written in invisible ink. The war in the Atlantic, by 1943, was not a contest anymore. It was a slow dissolution. And yet the engineers and the submariners and the naval strategists continued to innovate, to refine, to push forward, not because they believed victory was still possible, but because stopping was somehow unthinkable. The Schnorchel embodies this paradox perfectly. It was a life extension, a stay of execution, a technical marvel deployed in the service of a cause that was already lost. And perhaps that is where its true significance lies, not in changing the outcome, but in revealing something about human nature itself. We continue to build, to improve, to solve problems not primarily because we expect reward, but because the act of solving itself is woven into our nature. The technological duel that unfolded in the depths, U-boats with their schnorkels creeping along at reduced speed, the Allies developing ever more sensitive sonar and radar to detect them, this was not truly a contest between systems. It was a conversation between minds, separated by kilometers of water and years of accumulated fear, each side learning to think as the other thought, each side anticipating moves that had not yet been made, and within that conversation, the Schnorchel functioned as a kind of central pivot point. It did not win battles, it did not alter the grand strategic narrative, but it changed the texture of the contest itself. It made new forms of submarine warfare possible. It extended the range of human endurance just enough to matter in ways that statistics cannot fully capture. Think, for a moment, about what it means for an engineer to sit at a drafting table and design a device knowing, with reasonable certainty, that its primary function will be to allow men to remain trapped in a confined space for longer periods of time while engaging in an activity that is fundamentally dangerous. There is a peculiar kind of moral weight to that undertaking. You are not designing a comfort. You are not designing a safety margin. You are designing a method of delaying the inevitable while adding stress, illness, psychological strain. And yet you do this because the alternative is worse. This is the terrain on which the Schnorchel exists, not as triumph, but as an articulation of how human beings respond when the world narrows down to its essentials. The crews themselves understood this, perhaps more clearly than anyone. They volunteered or were conscripted to serve on U-boats equipped with schnorkels, knowing that submersion would now last longer, that darkness would be deeper and more prolonged, that the engine running beneath their feet would foul the air with carbon monoxide and diesel fumes, and the smell of unwashed bodies in spaces too small for human comfort. They understood that the valve above them might fail, that a sudden swell might flood the boat, that the psychological strain of extended submersion was itself a form of danger, as grave as any external threat. And they did this not because they were assured of success, but because they were asked. This is perhaps the most human element of all, not the cleverness of the design, but the willingness to bear its consequences. By the time the Schnorchel became standard equipment on German U-boats, the technology represented something that had accumulated meaning far beyond its mechanical function. It was a symbol of continuation, of resistance through adaptation, of the refusal to accept obsolescence. It prolonged the war in the Atlantic by months, not because it reversed any fundamental disadvantage, but because it made the U-boat fleet viable in an environment where it should have been extinct. It was not a game changer. It was a small gesture against the inevitable, but gestures matter. They matter because they reveal how human beings think when they are pressed against the limits of what they can endure. And here is where the story begins, its slow transformation from the specific to the universal. The Schnorchel was not unique in this regard. It was simply one example among thousands of wartime innovations born from the collision between necessity and ingenuity. But what makes it particularly illuminating is how completely it demonstrates the way that human beings, when truly desperate, do not simply solve immediate problems. We solve them in ways that open up new possibilities, new forms of existence, new paths into the future. The Schnorchel allowed submarines to operate differently, to think of themselves differently, to extend their operational range in both space and time. It was a small invention, in technical terms, but small innovations, when they emerge from genuine necessity and genuine pressure, often carry within them seeds that grow far beyond their original context. Consider how the technology flowed forward after the war ended. The Schnorchel did not disappear into history, along with the U-boats themselves. Instead, it was absorbed into the technical inheritance of submarines worldwide. Post-war submarine design, particularly in the Soviet Union and later in other naval powers, built upon the conceptual foundation that the Schnorchel had established, the idea that a submerged vessel might operate its diesel engines while remaining beneath the surface, that the range and endurance of submarines might be expanded through clever engineering. Modern diesel-electric submarines, with their sophisticated snorkel systems and air-independent propulsion technology, are spiritual descendants of that wartime tube. The line runs directly and unbroken from the desperation of 1943 to the submarine technology of today. This is how human innovation actually works, far more often than we acknowledge, not through dramatic breakthroughs or sudden flashes of genius, but through the accumulation of small responses to pressure. A problem arises, the pressure to solve it mounts. Engineers and technicians work within the constraints they face. And in the process of solving that one specific problem, they often create tools and approaches that prove applicable in ways they never anticipated. The Schnorchel was designed to keep U-boats alive. In doing so, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of submarine technology for the next 80 years. This is not causality in the simple sense. This is the complex, non-linear way that human civilization actually develops, not as a grand plan, but as a series of responses to immediate crises that echo forward into futures we cannot imagine. The men who designed and built and operated the Schnorchel could not have foreseen any of this. They were focused on survival, on extending the interval, on solving the problem in front of them. And yet in their narrow focus, in their willingness to engage with difficulty and danger, for no promise of ultimate success, they were contributing to something far larger than themselves. This is a truth that the modern world, with its emphasis on disruption and innovation and first-mover advantage, sometimes obscures. Real progress, real advancement, often comes not from the anticipation of the future, but from the acceptance of present necessity. It comes from people doing the best they can with what they have, under circumstances they did not choose and cannot escape. As the Schnorchel moves back into the depths of history now, as the submarines that carried it rust away in preservation yards or rest on the ocean floor, what remains is this strange gift that wartime pressure left behind. The technology itself is superseded, but the principle endures, that human beings, pressed against their limits, can think sideways, can find approaches that were not there before, can extend the reach of what is possible. The Schnorchel was a small tube through which air passed, allowing life to continue for a few hours longer beneath the surface. But in a deeper sense, it was a tube through which the future passed, carrying forward the seeds of submarine technology that still shapes military and commercial operations today. And that transformation, from the immediate and desperate to the enduring and foundational, is perhaps the truest measure of what human ingenuity, under pressure, can accomplish. And so the Atlantic, which had held so many secrets in its depths for so long, began at last to release them back into daylight and memory. The war itself, that terrible, relentless pressure that had driven men to imagine a thin metal tube as salvation, as the margin between survival and the black infinite, had already faded into the past by the time the last engine room crews finally secured their diesel throttles for the final time. The Schnorchel, that humble arrangement of valves and float chambers and precisely engineered breathing passages, had done what it was designed to do. It had kept men alive. It had kept engines running in the dark. It had extended, for some, the duration of a war that no one truly wished to continue fighting. The sea at dawn, as it always has, knows nothing of human conflict. The waves that had threatened 1,000 times to pour through a Schnorchel mast and drown the men below, those same waves now rolled in endless, patient rhythms, indifferent to whether submarines drifted beneath them or not. The sun, breaking across the eastern horizon in that particular way it does when night finally surrenders, touches the water with a gentleness that feels almost like forgiveness. There is no urgency in this light, no sonar ping cutting through the silence, no lookout straining his eyes across an empty surface, searching for the dark shape of an aircraft that might appear without warning. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, in the North Atlantic, in the Baltic approaches, the last of the U-boats, battered, fuel-starved, crewed by men who had grown old in the war's compressed span of years, were already being surrendered. The Schnorchel technology that had once seemed like an impossible innovation, that leap of imagination which had promised to change everything, was becoming instead a footnote, a historical detail, a small mechanical device that had mattered tremendously for a brief, intense period, and would now slowly be absorbed into the longer story of how submarines evolved, how technology adapts, how human beings solve the unsolvable problems of surviving in places where they do not belong. Yet something persists, does it not, in the way such inventions echo forward. The engineers and designers who would come after, the men who built the submarines of the Cold War, who imagined the nuclear-powered vessels that could remain submerged for months, who refined and perfected the diesel-electric technology into forms that still exist in navies across the world today. They inherited the Schnorchel's lesson that a thin, carefully engineered passage between two worlds is sometimes all that stands between existence and oblivion. That ingenuity born from desperation often outlasts the desperation itself, transforming into something that endures. The water continues its work, as it always does. It fills crevasses and settles over wrecks. It carries the sediment of years downward, slowly burying the remains of the submarines that did not survive, the ones whose schnorkels failed, whose crews could not be saved, whose engines ran one final time before the pressure became too great and the steel gave way. These become part of the ocean floor's quiet archaeology, part of the landscape of loss that no one sees in the bright hours of daylight, that no one swims above without knowing what lies beneath. The Pacific is waking now, if we might follow its slow dawn as well. In those quieter, deeper trenches, other submarines moved in those final years, not U-boats, but I-class vessels of the Japanese Navy, also experimenting with their own versions of snorkel technology, also driven by the same desperate need to breathe underwater, to remain hidden, to survive against odds that grew worse with each passing month. The human problem, it seems, was universal. The solution, in its fundamental architecture, was remarkably similar across oceans and nations and the vast divides of war. Show men an impossible requirement, and they will find a way to solve it. Give them a tube and a float valve, and the understanding that their lives depend on precise engineering, and they will make it work. There is a strange peace in reflecting on this, in understanding that the Schnorchel represents something both specific and eternal. It is specific to its moment, to the desperate years of 1943 and 1944 and 1945, to the particular vulnerability of submarines caught between the old way of surfacing and the new world of radar and aircraft and allied countermeasures that made the surface lethally dangerous. But it is also eternal in its essence, in what it teaches us about human creativity under pressure, about the power of a single good idea to alter the course of events, about the way that sometimes the smallest innovations carry the largest consequences. The morning grows clearer now. The horizon widens. The darkness that has held us for so long, the weight of water and steel, and the breath of men who could not quite escape their predicament, begins to lift. The submarines that carry the Schnorchel technology forward into the post-war world do so silently, efficiently, almost invisibly. They become museum pieces, or they become the ancestors of modern navies' vessels. But either way, they carry that inheritance with them, that memory of innovation, born from necessity, of a small tube that let diesel engines breathe at depth, of crew members who trusted in engineering and human skill to keep them alive a little longer. And the war itself, as we drift away from it now, becomes something like a bad dream that recedes with the coming of proper light. The urgency fades, the fear loosens its grip. The men who lived through the claustrophobic horror of a submerged compartment growing thick with diesel fumes and carbon monoxide, and the particular terror of knowing that one mistake, one mechanical failure, one incoming torpedo could end everything in seconds, they will carry those memories always, but they will also slowly return to an ordinary world. They will walk on land again. They will breathe air that comes freely from above, not through a carefully engineered valve. They will sleep in beds that do not rock with the sea's motion. They will gradually, gently, allow the war to become something they remember rather than something they are still living through. The Schnorchel, that unpretentious invention, will meanwhile continue its quiet work in the submarines that survive, in the new submarines that are built in the decades to come, in the refinements and improvements that engineers will make to its basic design. It will become smaller, more reliable, more efficient. It will be adapted for different purposes, different navies, different underwater scenarios, but its essential function will remain unchanged. That simple, elegant solution to the problem of how to keep an engine running when the vessel that contains it must remain hidden beneath the surface of the sea. Consider, if you will, the peculiar comfort that comes from understanding how small innovations can reshape history. There is something almost meditative about tracing a technology backward to its moment of invention, watching how pressure and creativity combined to produce something that seemed, in its context, almost miraculous. And then watching that innovation spread, evolve, become integrated into the larger systems of the world, until it is no longer remarkable but simply assumed, simply part of the way things are done. This is how human progress moves, often, not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of small, clever solutions to immediate problems. The ocean at dawn contains no record of what happened in its depths during the war. The water renews itself, the currents clear away the evidence. The surface, touched now by the full warmth of morning light, shows no scars from the technological struggle that raged in the darkness below. If a contemporary sailor were to sail across these same waters today, they would see nothing to suggest the intensity of what occurred here. The desperation, the innovation, the daily acts of human survival that depended on something as simple as a tube extending from a submarine's hull, allowing it to breathe while hiding. But we know now, do we not, that such invisibility does not mean such things were unimportant. On the contrary, it may suggest the opposite, that the most crucial moments of history often pass unwitnessed, hidden in places we cannot easily reach, carried out by people whose names we will never know, powered by technologies that seem humble and unimpressive only because they work so completely. The Schnorchel was one such invention, a small thing, a nearly anonymous contribution to the vast machinery of war. And yet it mattered, in its quiet way. It kept engines running. It kept men alive a little longer. It extended a conflict that was already moving toward its own inevitable conclusion, but it did so through a mechanism of such precise engineering and human cleverness that it merited, in this moment, our slow and patient attention. And